Picture a quirkless boy, chosen not by All Might, but by the moon itself. When Midoriya inherits the ancient power of Jack Frost, the heat of battle turns to absolute zero. How does the Guardian of Winter change UA's history? Prepare for a chilling reimagining of a hero's journey.
Welcome, Legends, to Chronos Recom. I wrote this story myself, so if you have any suggestions or what-ifs you want to see, drop it in the comments below. Also, just wanted to let you know I've got a Patreon set up now for anyone who wants to support the channel directly. You can get early access to stories, submit direct fan requests, and get exclusive content. It's totally optional, but if you want to help keep these stories coming, check it out. Links in the description. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Let's dive into this story.
The winter Izuku Midoriya died and was reborn happened when he was 4 years old, on a day so cold that frost formed patterns on every window in Musutafu, like the fingers of some ancient god reaching across glass. He didn't remember much about the boy he'd been before, just fragments, really, scattered like ice crystals on a frozen lake. But he remembered the screaming, the way the other children's voices had cut through the air as the ice beneath them splintered with sounds like gunshots. He remembered his mother's face, twisted in horror, her hand reaching out, but too far away, always too far away. And he remembered the feeling that had surged through his small body in that moment. Something vast and cold and impossibly old, something that whispered in a voice like wind through winter trees. Save them. The power had erupted from him without permission, without training, without any of the careful control that quirks were supposed to develop gradually under professional supervision. One moment he was a quirkless boy everyone pitied, and the next ice was blooming from his fingertips like flowers made of frozen starlight, pushing the children away from the cracking surface, shoving them toward the shore with walls of crystalline safety. He hadn't understood what he was doing. He only knew that he couldn't let them fall, couldn't let them drown in the black water beneath the ice, couldn't let them die when he had this impossible thing living in his chest that screamed at him to protect, to save, to push them away, even if it meant. The ice had shattered beneath his feet. The water had been so cold it burned, colder than anything a 4-year-old could comprehend, colder than the winter air, colder than the void between stars. He'd sunk like a stone, his small lungs burning, his vision filling with darkness and distant light filtering through ice that had already begun to freeze over the hole he'd fallen through. He'd clawed at it, desperate, terrified, wanting his mother, wanting warmth, wanting to breathe, wanting to live. But something else had wanted him more. The thing that lived in winter, the spirit that danced on frozen ponds and painted frost on windows, the guardian of fun and joy and play, the immortal boy who'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Jack Frost had found him there, dying in the dark water, and had made a choice that changed everything. When they pulled Izuku out 4 minutes later, his heart had stopped. The paramedics worked on him with desperate efficiency while his mother sobbed, and the children he'd saved watched with wide, traumatized eyes. His lips were blue. His skin was white as fresh snow. They shocked him once, twice, 3 times, and on the 3rd time his eyes opened. But they weren't the same eyes that had closed. They were crystalline blue, bright as winter sky, cold as the heart of a glacier. His hair, previously dark green like his mother's, had turned completely white, frost clinging to the strands like it belonged there. His skin never regained its color, remaining pale as porcelain, no matter how much time he spent in the sun. And his body temperature dropped to levels that should have killed him, but instead felt perfectly, completely natural. The doctors called it a quirk awakening, triggered by extreme trauma. They'd seen stranger things. Izuku Midoriya held her son and tried not to cry at how cold he felt against her skin, how his embrace no longer carried any warmth, how he looked at her with eyes that seemed older than they should be. But Izuku was alive, and that was what mattered. That was what she told herself every night when she tucked him into bed, and he didn't shiver even though his room felt like a freezer to her, when he walked barefoot across winter snow without flinching, when frost spread across his bed sheets in intricate, impossible patterns that looked almost deliberate. The staff had appeared 3 days after the incident. Izuku found it in the park where he'd nearly died. A gnarled branch of dark wood that had been perfectly preserved under the ice, its surface covered in a layer of frost that never melted, no matter how hard he tried to wipe it away. The moment his fingers touched it, he'd felt something click into place inside him, like finding a limb he hadn't known was missing. The staff became his constant companion, and through it, the powers that had saved those children began to make sense. He could fly. Not really flying, not like some quirks that granted actual flight, but riding winter winds that seemed to appear whenever he needed them, currents of cold air that lifted him up and carried him wherever he wanted to go with a freedom that made his heart soar. He could create ice from nothing, frost spreading from his fingertips or his staff in patterns so intricate they looked like art, structures so complex they seemed impossible. He could freeze anything he touched with enough focus, could summon snow from clear skies, could make winter bow to his will in ways that defied every natural law. But the power came with a price he didn't understand until years later, when he'd started elementary school and realized that none of the other children really saw him. Oh, they saw the white hair and the bare feet and the strange boy who was always cold, but they didn't see him, not really. They looked through him like he was made of ice himself, transparent and forgettable, even when he used his quirk, creating little frost patterns on desks to make them laugh, tossing snowballs during recess that filled whoever they hit with inexplicable joy. They'd enjoy the moment and then forget who'd done it. He was the winter boy, the cold child, the one who stood at the edge of playgrounds with frost collecting on his shoulders and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The loneliness had been crushing at first. He'd tried so hard to be seen, to be remembered, to matter to someone other than his mother. But gradually, over the years, he'd learned to adapt. If people were going to overlook him anyway, he might as well have fun with it. He became playful, mischievous, using his powers to create small moments of magic and wonder wherever he went. He'd leave frost patterns on windows that looked like dragons or heroes. He'd make it snow on hot summer days in parks, just for a few minutes, watching children's faces light up with delight. He'd freeze puddles into perfect skating rinks overnight. He didn't do it for recognition anymore. He did it because somewhere deep inside, in the place where Jack Frost's spirit had merged with his own, he understood that bringing joy to others was what mattered, even if they never knew who to thank. And he smiled. Always smiled. That bright, playful expression that hid the aching emptiness underneath, the loneliness that came from being seen but not known, watched but not understood, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone in ways that had nothing to do with physical proximity, and everything to do with the ice that had claimed his heart that winter day. Bakugo Katsuki had noticed him, though, unfortunately. They'd been in the same elementary school, and Bakugo, with his explosive quirk and even more explosive personality, had seen Izuku not as someone to overlook, but as someone to challenge. At first, Bakugo had tried the usual dominance games, the posturing and threats that worked on other kids. But Izuku had just laughed, that infuriating, genuinely amused laugh, and created a small ice wall between them with a casual tap of his staff. Bakugo's explosion had cratered the wall but hadn't melted it. The ice had been too cold, too dense, infused with something that went beyond normal thermodynamics into the realm of pure winter magic. That had been the beginning of their rivalry. Bakugo pushed harder, created bigger explosions, tried to prove he was stronger, but no matter how hot his blasts burned, they couldn't melt Izuku's permafrost, that special ice so cold it existed in defiance of heat itself. And Izuku, with his playful nature and complete lack of fear, had treated every confrontation like a game, smiling and teasing and never taking Bakugo's rage seriously, which only made the explosive boy angrier. "Your flames are impressive," Izuku had said once, standing in the middle of a circle of scorched earth, completely untouched by the explosion that had cratered the ground around him, protected by a dome of ice that hadn't even cracked. "But winter doesn't burn, Bakugo. It just waits." The words had been casual, almost friendly, but they'd hit Bakugo like a physical blow. because they both knew what Izuku meant, that no matter how hard Bakugo tried, there was a fundamental limitation to his power when facing someone who could create cold that fire couldn't overcome. It wasn't that Izuku was necessarily stronger, it was that their quirks existed in opposition, and in that specific matchup, Winter had the advantage. Middle school had been more of the same. 3 years of Bakugo trying to prove himself, while Izuku floated through classes with good grades and that eternal smile, making friends with the wind and leaving frost flowers on desks and never quite connecting with any of his classmates in a way that lasted. He'd learned to be content with that, or at least to pretend he was. The loneliness had become familiar, almost comfortable, a constant companion like the cold that never left his skin. But he'd also grown stronger. He practiced with his staff every day, learning to channel his power with increasing precision and creativity. He could freeze individual raindrops in midair, could create ice sculptures so detailed they looked alive, could summon blizzards or gentle snow flurries depending on his mood. He learned to fight, teaching himself through experimentation and instinct, discovering that combat came naturally to him in ways that felt like muscle memory from a life he'd never lived. He was fast, agile, creative, using wind to maneuver and ice to control the battlefield, fighting with a smile that unnerved anyone who saw it because it looked genuine, even when he was in mortal danger. And he'd set his sights on UA. High school, the most prestigious hero academy in Japan, because if he was going to be the Winter Spirit incarnate, if he was going to carry Jack Frost's legacy in a world of quirks and heroes, he might as well do it properly. He wanted to be a hero not for fame or recognition. He'd long since given up on being truly seen, but because the power that lived in his chest demanded it. The spirit that had saved him from death had one core purpose: protect others, bring them joy, make them believe in magic and wonder and the possibility of happiness even in the darkest winter. So when the day of UA's entrance exam arrived, Izuku walked through the gates barefoot despite the spring warmth, his frost-covered staff resting casually against his shoulder, white hair catching the morning light like fresh snow, crystalline blue eyes scanning the other applicants with mild curiosity. He felt their stares, heard the whispers, saw the way they looked at his bare feet and pale skin and the frost that seemed to follow him like a pet. "Is that guy okay?" someone muttered. "Why isn't he wearing shoes? Maybe it's part of his quirk," another suggested. "He looks like he's freezing. Someone should tell him it's not winter anymore." Izuku smiled to himself, amused as always by the irony. He wasn't cold. He'd never been cold since that day in the lake. Cold was his natural state, his home, his essence. The spring warmth felt wrong against his skin, uncomfortable in ways he couldn't explain to people who lived in heat and sweat and normal body temperatures. But he didn't bother explaining. Let them wonder. Let them whisper. He'd be gone in a moment anyway. Just another face in the crowd, another nameless applicant among hundreds. Except this time would be different. This time, he was going to make sure they remembered. The written exam was easy enough. Izuku had always been smart, his mind sharp and analytical beneath the playful exterior. But the practical exam was where things got interesting. Present Mike explained the rules to the assembled students, his voice booming across the staging area, describing the robots they'd need to destroy to earn points. Izuku listened with half an ear, more focused on the wind currents around the massive practice city, feeling them shift and flow, knowing he could ride them whenever he needed. A boy with spiky black hair and an intense expression asked about the fourth robot type mentioned in the handout, and Present Mike explained it was a 0-point obstacle to be avoided. Izuku filed that information away, not particularly concerned. He wasn't here to game the system or maximize points strategically. He was here to show what the Winter Spirit could do. When the gates opened and Present Mike screamed, "Start!" most students hesitated for a crucial second, thrown by the lack of countdown. Izuku didn't hesitate. He never hesitated. The moment the word left Present Mike's lips, Izuku was moving, staff in hand, riding a gust of wind that lifted him over the crowd and into the city proper, white hair streaming behind him as he soared between buildings. The first robot he encountered was a 2-pointer. A boxy machine with mechanical arms that swiveled toward him with targeting sensors glowing red. Izuku landed in front of it with barely a sound, barefoot on asphalt, and tapped his staff against the robot's leg almost gently. Frost spread from the point of contact like a living thing, racing across metal surfaces, seeping into joints and circuits, freezing lubricants and shorting electronics. In 3 seconds, the entire robot was encased in ice so thick and cold it had turned opaque white. Izuku smiled, spun his staff once, and struck the frozen machine with the opposite end. The robot shattered like glass, pieces scattering across the street in a spray of frozen fragments. He moved on. A 3-pointer rolled around a corner, weapons charging, but Izuku was already in the air, wind carrying him up and over it. He didn't even need to land. He just pointed his staff downward as he passed overhead, and a bolt of concentrated ice shot out, striking the robot's central processing unit. The ice spread inward, freezing it from the core, and the machine simply stopped moving, frozen solid from the inside out. It was almost too easy. The robots were designed for conventional quirks, for students who would punch and blast and grapple with them. They weren't designed for someone who could freeze them with a touch, who could move through the air like wind itself, who could shatter metal that had been flash frozen to temperatures that made it as brittle as thin ice on a spring pond. Izuku found himself laughing as he worked, genuine enjoyment bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. This was fun. This was what he'd been made for, movement and power and the sheer joy of using his abilities without holding back. He froze robots mid-stride, created ice barriers that made them crash into each other, summoned patches of black ice on the ground that sent wheeled machines skidding into walls. He rode wind currents in complex aerial maneuvers, staff spinning in his hands, frost spreading wherever he pointed it. Other students stared as he passed, watching this barefoot boy with white hair laugh his way through the exam like it was a playground game instead of a high-stakes test. He caught glimpses of them. A girl with a frog-like appearance using her tongue to destroy a one-pointer, a boy with engines in his legs sprinting between targets, someone else creating objects from their body to smash robots apart. They were all so serious, so focused, treating this like a battle. Izuku understood that mindset. He really did. But he also understood that power fueled by joy was stronger than power fueled by desperation or anger. The more fun he had, the colder his ice became, the faster the wind carried him, the more precise his control grew. Jack Frost's magic responded to happiness, to playfulness, to the pure delight of being alive and moving and free. So he smiled and laughed and enjoyed himself. And his powers answered with devastating efficiency. He'd just frozen his 15th robot, a 3-pointer that now resembled an abstract ice sculpture, when he heard the screaming. The sound cut through his enjoyment like a knife through fresh snow, sharp and terrified and wrong. Izuku spun, staff ready, and saw it. The 0-pointer, massive as a building, mechanical and monstrous, rolling down the street with the inevitability of an avalanche. And in front of it, frozen in fear, was a girl with brown hair and a desperate expression, her leg trapped under rubble. She must have been buried under when the giant robot smashed through a building. Every other student was running away. That was the smart choice, the logical choice, the choice that would keep them safe and preserve their points. The 0-pointer was an obstacle to avoid, not a challenge to face. But Izuku had never been good at running away from people who needed help. The wind answered his call before he consciously summoned it, a powerful updraft that launched him into the air with enough force to leave Frost on the ground where he'd been standing. He shot upward like an arrow, staff extended, white hair whipping around his face, and other students turned to watch as this crazy barefoot boy flew directly at the massive robot everyone else was fleeing from. The 0-pointer sensors locked onto him, weapon systems activated. But Izuku was already moving too fast, riding winter winds with the ease of someone who'd been born to fly, weaving between targeting lasers with casual grace. He rose higher, until he was level with the robot's head, until he could see the mechanical complexity of its construction, the joints and servos and power systems that made it move. And then he touched his staff to its hull. The frost began at the point of contact, a small circle of white against gray metal. But it didn't stay small. It spread, racing across the robot's surface with unnatural speed, covering armor plating and weapon housings and sensor arrays in crystalline ice that gleamed in the sunlight. And as it spread outward, it also spread inward, seeping through gaps in the armor, finding the mechanisms underneath, the circuits and wiring and delicate electronics that made the zero-pointer function. The robot's movement slowed. Joints locked, weapon systems failed, and still the ice spread, faster and faster, feeding on itself, a chain reaction of absolute cold that consumed the massive machine from the inside out. Students watching from the ground saw the zero-pointer's entire structure turn white, saw frost bloom across every surface, saw what had been a terrifying obstacle become a massive ice sculpture in the span of perhaps 10 seconds. Izuku hung in the air beside it, held aloft by wind that seemed to blow from nowhere, and smiled his eternal smile. Then he raised his staff, spun it once in a movement that looked almost casual, and brought it down in a sharp gesture like conducting an orchestra. The zero-pointer shattered. Not cracked, not damaged. Shattered. The entire structure broke apart into millions of pieces, fragments of frozen metal that caught the light and reflected it in rainbow patterns, turning the destruction into something beautiful. The pieces didn't crash down like debris. They drifted, gentle as snowflakes, settling on the street and the buildings and the watching students like a strange winter snow in the middle of spring. Izuku descended with them, riding the wind down to where the brown-haired girl was still trapped. She stared at him with wide eyes as he landed beside her, barefoot on rubble, not even looking at the frozen fragments still falling around them. He knelt, touched his staff to the debris pinning her leg, and froze it solid. Then he tapped it gently, and it shattered like everything else he'd frozen, freeing her without causing additional injury. "You okay?" he asked, offering his hand. His voice was warm despite the cold that radiated from his skin. Friendly and genuinely concerned, she took his hand, then immediately pulled back, startled by how cold he felt. But she was free and uninjured and staring at him like he just descended from the sky, which technically he had. That was... She stammered, struggling to find words. "Fun?" Izuku suggested with a grin. "Yeah, it was. Don't worry about the big guy. He was just a robot anyway." "Can you walk?" She nodded mutely, still staring, and Izuku helped her up before turning to look at the exam grounds around them. Frozen robot parts littered the streets. Other students were emerging from cover, looking at the settling snowflake fragments with expressions of awe and confusion. And in the observation room, Izuku knew teachers were watching on monitors, seeing what the winter spirit could really do when he stopped holding back. "Time's up." Present Mike's voice boomed across the city, and Izuku felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The exam was over. He'd done what he came to do, shown them something they wouldn't forget, proven that the barefoot boy with white hair wasn't someone to overlook. He'd made them see him. The brown-haired girl was still watching him as he turned to leave, and he caught her expression. Wonder mixed with confusion, mixed with something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like maybe, just for a moment, she'd really seen him, not just as the weird ice boy, but as a person who'd saved her without hesitation. "Thank you," she said quietly, and Izuku's smile softened into something more genuine. "Winter's here to help," he said, which didn't make much sense but felt right anyway. Then he lifted off on another wind current, staff in hand, leaving her standing in the settling frost snow, and flew toward the exit gates. He didn't see the way other students watched him go, didn't hear their whispered questions about who he was and what his quirk could do. He was already thinking ahead to the results, to whether UA would accept someone like him, to whether this would finally be the place where he belonged. The letter came a week later, delivered by a small projector device that displayed All Might's face in miniature, explaining that Izuku had not only earned combat points for the robots he'd destroyed, but had also earned rescue points for saving the girl, points awarded for heroic behavior that showed the kind of character UA was looking for. His combined score placed him 3rd overall in the entrance exam rankings. "Welcome to UA, young Midoriya," All Might's projection declared with his trademark smile. "Your power is remarkable, and your heroic instincts are exactly what we need. I look forward to teaching you how to be the kind of this world needs." Inko cried when she saw the letter, hugging her son despite how cold he felt, telling him how proud she was, how she'd always known he was special. Izuku hugged her back and smiled and tried to ignore the part of him that still felt fundamentally separate from this moment, like he was watching it happen to someone else. He was happy. He really was. But happiness and loneliness weren't mutually exclusive, and the ice in his chest never quite thawed. Still, this was what he'd wanted. UA meant training with the best, meant learning to be a hero properly, meant maybe, just maybe, finding people who could see past the frost and eternal smile to whatever was underneath. He started preparing immediately, spending his days before school began practicing with his staff, pushing his powers to new limits, seeing what he could really do when he stopped being careful. He could summon localized blizzards now, winter storms contained in small areas. He could sense weather patterns, feel when snow was coming, predict temperature changes with uncanny accuracy. He could create ice constructs complex enough to function as temporary buildings, freeze the moisture in the air itself into floating platforms, ride wind currents fast enough to leave sonic booms in his wake. And the more he practiced, the more he felt the presence that lived inside him, the spirit that had merged with his soul that winter day. Jack Frost, the eternal child, the guardian of fun, the lonely winter spirit who'd existed for centuries without anyone to truly see him. They weren't separate entities anymore. They were one being, one consciousness. Izuku Midoriya, who was also Jack Frost, the winter spirit reborn in a world that had forgotten magic but desperately needed it. The first day at UA arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures that made Izuku's skin crawl. He showed up barefoot as always, staff slung across his back, white hair freshly frosted from the cold shower he preferred. Other students stared as he walked through the gates, and he heard the whispers, felt the eyes tracking his movement. But he was used to it by now, comfortable with being the strange one, the cold one, the boy who didn't quite fit normal parameters. Class 1A's homeroom was on the 3rd floor, and Izuku took the stairs instead of the elevator, leaving frost footprints on each step that melted quickly in the spring warmth. He found his assigned seat, near the back naturally, because that's where unusual students always ended up, and settled in, propping his staff against the desk. Other students filtered in, gradually, and Izuku recognized a few faces from the entrance exam. The brown-haired girl from the zero-pointer incident was there, and she waved enthusiastically when she saw him, floating over obstacles to reach his desk with a quirk that was apparently gravity-based. "You're the one who saved me," she said brightly. "I never got to properly thank you. I'm Uraraka Ochako." "Izuku Midoriya," he replied with his usual smile, noting the way she kept a careful distance, not trying to touch him again after that first cold handshake during the exam. "Though winter works too, if you prefer." "Winter?" She tilted her head, confused but intrigued. "Long story?" he said, which was both true and a deflection. "Nice to see you made it in. How's the leg?" "Perfect. Recovery girl healed it completely. But seriously, what you did with that robot?" She trailed off, eyes wide with remembered awe. "I've never seen anything like it. Is your quirk ice-based?" Before Izuku could answer, an explosion of sound and fury announced Bakugo's arrival. The blonde boy stormed into the classroom with his usual aggressive energy, spotted Izuku immediately, and his face twisted into an expression of frustrated rage that Izuku found both predictable and amusing. "Of course you're here," Bakugo snarled, slamming his hand on a desk that wasn't his own, "acting like you're hot shit because you can freeze things. This doesn't change anything. I'm still going to prove I'm stronger than you." Izuku just smiled that infuriating smile, the one that made Bakugo's eye twitch. "Sure, Bakugo. Whatever you say." He kept his tone light, playful, completely unintimidated, which only made Bakugo angrier. "Don't patronize me, you." Problem, children?" A tired voice interrupted from the doorway, and everyone turned to see a man wrapped in what looked like a sleeping bag standing. No, lying. Just outside the classroom. "This is the hero course, not a playground. If you're going to fight, take it outside. Otherwise, sit down and shut up." The man wriggled into the classroom, still wrapped in his sleeping bag, which should have been comical, but somehow wasn't. There was something dangerous in his exhausted expression, something that suggested he could back up his authority with force if needed. I'm Aizawa Shota, your homeroom teacher. Get changed into your gym uniforms and meet me outside. We're doing a quirk assessment test. The class erupted in questions, but Aizawa just stared them down with bloodshot eyes until they quieted. UA is where you learn to push past your limits. We're going to establish a baseline for your abilities, then work on improving them. Now get moving. The locker room was the usual chaos of teenage boys changing clothes and showing off quirks, but Izuku changed quietly in a corner, pulling on the UA gym uniform and leaving his feet bare as always. He'd learned long ago that shoes were pointless. They just filled with frost and became uncomfortable within minutes. Besides, his feet never hurt, never blistered, never felt the pain of rough ground. The cold had made them impervious to such mundane concerns. Outside, Aizawa lined them up and explained the test. 8 events measuring different physical and quirk-based abilities, same as middle school fitness tests, but with powers allowed. Then he dropped the bomb. Whoever scored last overall would be expelled immediately. The class protested, calling it unfair, but Aizawa's expression didn't change. Natural disasters, villains, accidents. The world isn't fair. Heroes who can't handle pressure don't deserve to be here. Now, Bakugo, you scored first in the entrance exam. How far could you throw a softball in middle school? 67 meters, Bakugo answered, grinning viciously. Then get in the circle and throw it using your quirk. Show us what you can do. Bakugo stepped up with his characteristic arrogance, wound up, and threw the ball with a massive explosion that sent it rocketing into the distance. The handheld device Aizawa held beeped, displaying the distance, 705.2 meters. That's how we'll be doing things, Aizawa announced, showing the class the score. Use your quirks to push yourselves. This is what heroics is about, maximizing your natural talents. The test began. Students took turns throwing, running, jumping, demonstrating their abilities with varying degrees of success. Izuku watched with mild interest, analyzing their quirks, seeing how they approached each challenge. A boy with a tail used it for balance and power. A girl with earphone jacks extended them to incredible lengths. Someone with multiple arms used them for compound movements. When his turn came for the grip strength test, Izuku simply wrapped his hand around the device and let frost spread across it, the ice contracting as it froze, applying pressure that made the machine creak. The reading climbed steadily, 100 kilograms, 200 kilograms, 300 kilograms, before Aizawa told him to stop before he broke the equipment. Izuku released it with a shrug, and the device was covered in a thin layer of ice that other students touched curiously. The standing long jump was almost trivial. He just rode a wind current across the entire sandbox in one smooth motion, landing barefoot in the sand on the other side without even trying. Students stared, and someone muttered something about flying, quirks being unfair. But Aizawa just made a note on his tablet. The softball throw was where things got interesting. Izuku stepped into the circle, accepted the ball from Aizawa, and felt its weight, its composition, the way moisture from the air had collected on its surface. He could freeze that moisture, use it as a platform, combine wind and ice to send the ball somewhere truly ridiculous. But that felt like overkill. Instead, he simply tossed the ball straight up, pointed his staff at it, and created a powerful updraft combined with a platform of frozen air beneath the ball. The wind caught it and carried it higher, higher, pushing it up on currents that existed purely because Izuku willed them to, while the ice platform kept reforming underneath to prevent the ball from falling back down. It rose like a rocket, shrinking to a speck against the blue sky, and Aizawa's device kept climbing. 800 meters, 900 meters, 1,000 meters, still going. Finally, at 1,247.3 meters, Izuku released his control and let the ball fall. Somewhere in the distance, it would eventually come down, but by then, the test would be over. Show off, Bakugo muttered, loud enough for Izuku to hear, and Izuku just smiled. The tests continued. The repeated sidesteps were easy with wind assistance, letting Izuku move back and forth so fast his white hair became a blur. The distance run was almost boring. He rode air currents the entire way, completing it in a time that would have been impossible for someone actually running. The sit-ups were the only test where his quirk didn't help much, but his body was unnaturally strong anyway, conditioned by years of training with his staff, and he finished with a respectable score. When all was said and done, Aizawa displayed the final rankings on his tablet. Izuku had placed second overall, beaten only by a girl named Yayorozu Momo, who could create objects from her body and had used that versatility to excel in every category. Bakugo was third, his expression thunderous as he stared at the rankings, clearly furious that both Izuku and this Yayorozu girl had scored higher than him. The student in last place was a boy with purple balls for hair who'd relied entirely on his quirk, something involving sticky spheres, and had no physical conditioning to fall back on. He looked terrified as Aizawa approached him, clearly expecting to be sent home immediately. By the way, Aizawa said, his exhausted expression shifting into something that might have been a smirk, the expulsion was a lie, a logical ruse to make you give your best effort. The class erupted in protests and relieved laughter, but Izuku just tilted his head, studying their teacher with new appreciation. The man was craftier than he looked, using psychological pressure to push students beyond their comfort zones. It was manipulative, certainly, but also effective. Every student had gone all out, shown what they could really do, given Aizawa a clear picture of their capabilities. Smart. Ruthless, but smart. We're done for today, Aizawa continued, already turning away. Pick up a syllabus from the classroom on your way out, and Midoriya, stay behind for a moment. Izuku waited as the other students filtered away, some of them glancing back curiously. When they were alone, Aizawa studied him with those tired, analytical eyes. Your quirk is extremely powerful, the teacher said bluntly. Flight, ice manipulation, wind control. That's already more versatile than most pro heroes, but I noticed something during the tests. You hold back. Izuku blinked, genuinely surprised. I placed second. You could have placed first easily. That softball throw? You were controlling your power, keeping it from going too high. The grip strength test? You stopped because I told you to, but you could have crushed that device into powder. Even your combat performance in the entrance exam, I watched the footage. You shattered a 0-pointer like it was made of glass, but you were smiling the whole time, treating it like a game. That level of casual power suggests you're operating well below your actual limits. There was no accusation in Aizawa's tone, just observation, but Izuku felt something shift in his chest anyway. This teacher saw things others missed, noticed the details that revealed truth beneath surface performance. I have my reasons, Izuku said carefully, his smile still in place but his eyes a bit colder. Power that enjoys itself lasts longer than power that burns too bright too fast. I learned that a long time ago. Aizawa was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. As long as you're prepared to go all out when it matters. In a real emergency, against real villains, holding back could get people killed. Remember that. I never hold back when someone needs saving, Izuku replied, and there was no playfulness in his voice now, just cold certainty. The robots at the entrance exam didn't need my full power. If they had, they would have gotten it. Another pause, longer this time, as Aizawa assessed him with the gaze of someone who'd seen too many students fail to live up to their potential. Finally, the teacher nodded again. Good. Dismissed. Izuku left, staff in hand, and found several of his classmates waiting outside the building. Uraraka was there, along with a boy with glasses who'd been very serious during the tests, and a few others whose names he hadn't learned yet. That was amazing, Uraraka said as he approached. The way you threw that softball, I thought it was going to leave the atmosphere. Just wind and ice, Izuku demurred with his usual smile. Nothing special. Nothing special? The glasses boy pushed his frames up with one hand in a gesture that seemed habitual. Your quirk demonstrates remarkable versatility and power. I'm Ida Tenya, by the way. Your performance today was exemplary. Thanks, Izuku said, a bit overwhelmed by the enthusiasm. People didn't usually approach him like this, didn't seek him out for conversation. It felt strange, unfamiliar, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit right. A girl with pink skin and small horns bounced over, grinning widely. You're the barefoot winter guy. I'm Ashido Mina. Your hair is so cool. Is it naturally white or part of your quirk? Both? Neither? It's complicated, Izuku answered, which was the truth. His white hair was a result of his transformation, but also a manifestation of the winter spirit's essence. So it existed in a strange space between natural and supernatural. They walked together toward the school gates. This small group of students who decided for some reason that Izuku was worth talking to. He listened more than he spoke, letting them chatter about the tests and their quirks and their excitement about being at UA, and something warm flickered in his chest beneath all the cold. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe here, finally, he could form connections that lasted. But that warmth was fragile, easily lost, and as he walked barefoot across the warm pavement, frost spreading in his footsteps, Izuku reminded himself not to hope too hard. Hope was dangerous for someone like him, someone who existed half in the mortal world and half in the realm of eternal winter. Better to enjoy these moments as they came, and not expect them to last. Still, when Uraraka asked if he wanted to get food with her and Ida, Izuku found himself saying yes, and his smile felt almost genuine as they walked together through the streets of Musutafu, 3 students in UA. Uniforms talking about heroes and dreams and the future stretching out before them like fresh snow, waiting for footprints. The first week of classes passed in a blur of academic lessons and hero training. Izuku excelled in both. His analytical mind handled the theoretical coursework easily, while his combat instincts and power made the practical exercises almost trivial. All Might taught their hero training classes, and the massive symbol of peace had a teaching style that was enthusiastic if occasionally scattered. Their first exercise was combat training in pairs, heroes versus villains in indoor urban environments. Izuku was paired with a quiet boy named Tokoyami Fumikage, whose quirk manifested as a shadow creature he called Dark Shadow. Their opponents were Bakugo and Ida, and Izuku had smiled when he heard the matchup because, of course, the teachers would put him against Bakugo. Someone wanted to see how their rivalry would play out in a controlled environment. The exercise was simple. Bakugo and Ida were the villains guarding a weapon on the 5th floor of a building. Izuku and Tokoyami were the heroes who needed to capture the weapon or restrain the villains within 15 minutes. All Might gave the signal to start, and Izuku immediately tapped his staff against the building's outer wall. Frost spread across the entire structure in seconds, coating windows and walls and the roof in crystalline ice that turned the building into something from a winter fairy tale. Inside, he knew, the temperature would be dropping rapidly, condensation freezing on every surface, making footing treacherous. It was a psychological tactic more than a combat one, showing Bakugo from the start that Izuku controlled the environment, that this was his territory now. "We should approach cautiously," Tokoyami suggested, his deep voice at odds with his bird-like appearance. "Bakugo is aggressive and powerful. A direct confrontation might..." Izuku was already moving, riding a wind current straight up the outside of the building. Tokoyami sighed and followed more carefully, using Dark Shadow to help him climb. On the 5th floor, Bakugo was pacing like a caged animal, his palms crackling with small explosions, staring at the frost-covered windows with mounting frustration. "That bastard," he snarled, "trying to psych me out with his ice tricks. I'll show him." The window exploded inward in a shower of frozen fragments as Izuku came through riding a gust of wind, staff extended, white hair whipping around his face. He landed in the middle of the room with perfect balance, bare feet finding purchase on ice-slicked floor without slipping, and smiled his most infuriating smile at Bakugo. "Hey," he said casually, as if they'd run into each other at a convenience store instead of a combat exercise. "Nice place you've got here. Bit warm, though." He tapped his staff on the floor, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Frost began forming on the walls, creeping toward Bakugo and Ida with deliberate menace. Bakugo's response was immediate and explosive, literally. He launched himself forward with a blast from his palms, fist cocked back for a devastating right hook. But Izuku was already moving, flowing around the attack like water, riding a wind current that carried him in a smooth arc over Bakugo's head. As he passed, he tapped his staff against Bakugo's shoulder. Just a light touch, and ice bloomed where they made contact. Bakugo roared and spun, using an explosion to melt the ice before it could spread. But Izuku was already engaging Ida, who'd tried to rush him with his engine-powered speed. The glasses-wearing boy was fast, but Izuku could fly, and flying beat running in tight quarters. He rose to the ceiling, staff spinning, and created a series of ice pillars that blocked Ida's path and forced him to dodge instead of charge. "You're both so serious," Izuku called down, genuinely enjoying himself despite the danger. "This is supposed to be fun. Loosen up a bit." "Fun!" Bakugo screamed, launching himself upward with a massive explosion, hands outstretched to grab Izuku out of the air. "I'll show you fun, you frozen bastard!" Izuku let him get closer than was probably safe, then created a sphere of ice around himself, a perfect crystalline barrier that Bakugo's explosion struck with tremendous force. The ice cracked but held, and Bakugo fell back to the floor, landing in a crouch, breathing hard, his palms smoking. "Persistent," Izuku observed, dissolving his ice sphere and descending slightly. "I like that about you, Bakugo. You never give up, even when you're outmatched." "Outmatched? I'll kill you!" Another explosion, another charge, and this time Izuku didn't dodge. He met Bakugo head-on, staff sweeping in a wide arc that flash-froze the air between them into a wall of ice. Bakugo's fist hit it with explosive force, and the wall shattered, but the fragments didn't fall. Izuku was controlling them, turning broken ice into projectiles that shot back at Bakugo, forcing the blonde to blast them out of the air with rapid-fire explosions. Meanwhile, Tokoyami had entered through the window, and Dark Shadow was engaging Ida, keeping the speedster occupied. The room had become a chaotic battlefield of ice and explosions and shadows, temperature fluctuating wildly as Bakugo's heat fought against Izuku's cold. But Izuku was smiling through all of it, genuinely having the time of his life, because this was what he'd been made for: movement and combat, and the pure joy of using his powers creatively. Every attack Bakugo threw, Izuku countered with ice or wind. Every time Ida tried to rush the weapon, Tokoyami blocked him. The exercise had become less about the objective and more about the fight itself, about seeing what they could do when pushed. 10 minutes passed. 12. Bakugo was getting frustrated, his explosions growing bigger, less controlled, and Izuku saw the moment when his rival's temper overcame his tactics. Bakugo pulled the pin on one of his grenade-shaped gauntlets, and Izuku realized with a shock of alarm that the idiot was about to use his stored sweat explosion, the kind of massive blast that could level buildings. "Bakugo, don't," he started, but it was too late. The explosion was enormous, a blast wave of heat and force that should have destroyed half the floor. But Izuku reacted on pure instinct, dropping to the ground and slamming his staff down with both hands, releasing every bit of power he'd been holding back. Permafrost erupted from the point of impact, spreading in a dome around himself and Tokoyami, ice so cold it existed beyond normal thermodynamics, a barrier of winter's deepest freeze. The explosion hit the ice and stopped. Not slowed, not reduced, stopped. The heat couldn't penetrate permafrost, couldn't melt ice that cold, couldn't overcome the fundamental law that winter doesn't burn. The massive blast dissipated against Izuku's barrier like waves against a frozen shore, leaving everyone inside the dome completely unharmed. When the smoke cleared, the room was devastated. Walls were blackened, the floor cratered, the training weapon knocked over and damaged. But inside Izuku's dome of permafrost, everything was pristine, untouched, protected by winter's absolute defense. All Might's voice came over the speakers, slightly strained. "That's enough! The hero team wins. Bakugo, that was completely excessive. Everyone report to the monitoring room immediately." Izuku dissolved his ice dome slowly, letting the permafrost fade back into normal cold, and looked at Bakugo. The blonde was breathing hard, staring at the place where his ultimate attack had been completely negated, his expression a mixture of rage and something that might have been fear. "You're strong, Bakugo," Izuku said quietly, his playful tone gone, replaced by something colder and more serious. "Really strong. But strength without control is just destruction. If you'd killed someone with that blast, if I hadn't been here to stop it, your hero career would be over before it began." Bakugo's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't respond, didn't meet Izuku's eyes. For the first time, Izuku saw real doubt in his rival's expression, and it made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. He hadn't meant to break Bakugo's confidence, hadn't wanted to crush the fierce pride that drove the explosive boy forward, but he also couldn't let Bakugo hurt people with reckless attacks. Someone had to show him that there were limits, That power came with responsibility, that being the strongest didn't mean being the best. In the monitoring room, All Might lectured Bakugo about restraint and appropriate force, while praising Izuku's defensive instincts and Tokoyami's tactical support. But Izuku barely listened, too focused on the way Bakugo stood with his shoulders hunched, staring at the floor, looking smaller than Izuku had ever seen him. After class, Izuku caught up with him in the locker room. "Hey," he said, keeping his tone light, trying to find the playful energy that usually came so easily. "That was a good fight. You almost had me a few times." "Shut up," Bakugo muttered without any real heat. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not," Izuku insisted. "I mean it. Your combat instincts are incredible. You pushed me harder than anyone has in years. I actually had fun, which doesn't happen often." Bakugo finally looked up, red eyes meeting crystalline blue, and for a moment, something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, but a kind of understanding. They were rivals, would probably always be rivals, but there was respect there too, buried under all the ice and explosions. "Next time," Bakugo said quietly, "I'll find a way past your frozen barriers. I don't care if your ice is absolute zero or whatever bullshit physics you're using, I'll beat you." "I look forward to it," Izuku replied with a genuine smile, and meant it. Because having someone who pushed him, who refused to accept defeat, who kept coming back no matter how many times he lost, that was valuable in ways Bakugo probably didn't understand. The days turned into weeks, and Izuku settled into a routine at UA that felt almost normal. He made friends, real friends, people who sought him out and remembered his name and wanted to spend time with him. Uraraka was bright and cheerful, always floating things to make him laugh. Ida was serious and rule-bound, but genuinely kind underneath all the formality. Tokoyami appreciated Izuku's quiet moments, the times when he'd sit on the roof and watch winter clouds gather even though it was spring. Ashido dragged him to study groups and made him participate in class activities, refusing to let him isolate himself. But there were still moments when the loneliness crept in, when he felt the fundamental separation between himself and everyone else. Like when they went to lunch together and he couldn't eat hot food because it made him uncomfortable, preferring cold meals and frozen drinks. Or when someone would grab his hand in excitement and pull back from the cold, apologizing quickly, but leaving him feeling like something untouchable. Or late at night in the dorms when he could hear other students laughing together through the walls, and he'd stand at his window watching frost patterns form on the glass, feeling like a ghost observing life from outside. Todoroki Shoto was the one who noticed, the dual quirk user with half-frozen, half-burning heritage, who also struggled with temperature regulation and family trauma. They'd been paired for a training exercise, and Todoroki had observed quietly as Izuku worked, had seen the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the way he kept himself separate even while surrounded by people. "You're lonely," Todoroki said afterward. We got direct and blunt in a way most people avoided. "I can see it, the way you smile, but don't connect." Izuku had frozen, no pun intended, caught off guard by the unexpected insight. "I'm fine," he'd said automatically, defaulting to his usual deflection. "You're not," Todoroki insisted, "and I understand why. Being different, being set apart by your power, it creates distance you can't cross no matter how hard you try. I know, I've lived it." They'd talked then, really talked, sharing pieces of themselves neither had shown anyone else. Todoroki explained about his father Endeavor, the training that felt like abuse, the pressure to be perfect, the resentment toward his fireside. Izuku listened and offered what comfort he could, then shared his own story. The lake, the transformation, the years of being overlooked, the loneliness of being a winter spirit in a warm world. "But you bring joy to others," Todoroki had said, puzzled. "I've seen you make people smile, create beautiful things with your ice. How can you be lonely when you give so much?" "Because joy for others and connection for yourself aren't the same thing," Izuku had replied quietly. "I can make people happy for a moment, but they don't see me. They see the magic, the winter, the pretty frost patterns, not the person underneath." Todoroki had been silent for a long moment, processing that, and then, "I see you." 3 simple words, but they hit Izuku harder than any explosion Bakugo had ever thrown. Someone saw him, really saw him. Not just the winter spirit, not just the powerful quirk user, but Izuku Midoriya himself. They became close after that, in the way two lonely people often do when they recognize their isolation in each other. Not romantic, not exactly friendship either, but something deeper and stranger. Two souls who understood what it meant to be separate, to be different, to carry power that set you apart from everyone else. The months passed. Summer arrived, oppressively hot and miserable for Izuku, who spent most of his time in the air-conditioned school or creating small ice cocoons to sleep in. They trained constantly: rescue scenarios, combat exercises, villain simulations. Izuku excelled at all of it, his winter spirit powers proving versatile enough to handle virtually any situation. And then came the attack at the USJ training facility, the moment everything changed. They'd been told it was rescue training, a chance to practice hero work in different disaster scenarios. 13, the space hero, explained the various zones: landslide, fire, flood, wind, and others. Izuku listened with half an ear, more interested in the strange feeling crawling up his spine, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't quite place. Then the lights went out and a portal of dark mist opened in the central plaza and villains began pouring through. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all wearing dark clothing and hostile expressions. And at their center stood a man with hands covering his body, scratching at his neck, red eyes gleaming with madness. Shigaraki Tomura, Izuku would learn later, leader of the League of Villains, here to kill All Might and destroy the symbol of peace. 13, get the students to safety, Aizawa shouted, already rushing toward the villains, his capture weapon extending, ready to fight despite being outnumbered 100-1. But before they could retreat, the mist villain, Kurogiri, warped across the facility and surrounded the students. "I'm afraid I can't let you leave," the mist said in a polite, cultured voice completely at odds with the situation. "We've prepared special accommodations for each of you." The portal expanded and Izuku felt himself falling, the world twisting as space itself bent around them. He heard his classmates screaming, felt the disorientation of forced teleportation, and then he was somewhere else, somewhere cold and wet. The water zone. The absolute worst place Kurogiri could have sent him from the villain's perspective. Izuku landed on the surface of the massive pool that dominated this section of the facility, water splashing around his bare feet, and looked up to see dozens of aquatic villains surfacing around him. They had fins, gills, water manipulation quirks, clearly chosen specifically for this environment. They were grinning at him, confident, certain they had the advantage. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Izuku smiled his brightest smile, the one that hid everything dark and lonely underneath, and tapped his staff against the water's surface. "You know what?" he said conversationally, his voice carrying across the zone. "I really don't like being teleported without permission. It's rude." The frost began at the point where his staff touched water, a small circle of white ice. But it didn't stay small. It spread, racing outward in all directions, a chain reaction of absolute cold that consumed the entire pool in a matter of seconds. The water froze solid, top to bottom, edge to edge, transforming from liquid to ice so quickly that the villains didn't even have time to dive. They were trapped, dozens of them, frozen in ice up to their waists or higher, unable to move, unable to use their water-based quirks in an environment that was now completely solid. They screamed and struggled and tried to break free, but Izuku's ice was permafrost, cold beyond cold, unbreakable by normal means. And Izuku was skating across his frozen lake, staff in hand, whistling a winter tune his mother used to sing. He moved between the trapped villains with effortless grace, touching his staff to each one in turn, freezing them further until they stopped moving entirely, encased in ice cocoons that kept them alive but completely immobilized. "This is my domain," he said, still smiling, still playful, but with an edge of cold fury underneath. "Water becomes ice, ice belongs to winter, and winter belongs to me." It took him maybe 3 minutes to neutralize every villain in the water zone. 3 minutes to turn what should have been a death trap into a prison of his own making. When he was done, he stood in the center of his frozen lake, surrounded by dozens of ice-trapped villains, and looked toward the central plaza, where he could see Aizawa fighting desperately against overwhelming numbers. Time to help. He launched himself into the air on a wind current, staff extended behind him like a tail, white hair streaming, and flew toward the central plaza at speeds that left frost trails in the air. Below, he could see the battle. Aizawa surrounded, his capture weapon working overtime, but there were too many villains, and they were wearing him down. And standing near the edge, watching with those mad red eyes, was Shigaraki. Izuku descended like a winter storm, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees as he approached. Villains looked up, saw this barefoot boy with white hair flying through the air, and some of them laughed because he looked young and harmless and alone. They stopped laughing when he touched down and released a pulse of cold that flash froze every villain within 10 meters, turning them into ice statues mid-attack. "Sorry I'm late," Izuku called to Aizawa, spinning his staff casually. "Got a bit sidetracked in the water zone. You know how it is." Aizawa, bleeding from multiple injuries, stared at him with an expression that might have been relief or disbelief. "Midoriya, I told you to evacuate with the others." "And miss all the fun? No chance." Izuku's smile widened as more villains rushed him, and he moved to meet them, staff spinning, frost spreading wherever he touched. Besides, winter doesn't abandon people who need help. The fight became a blur of motion and ice. Izuku moved through the villains like wind through trees, untouchable, unstoppable, freezing anyone who got close. He wasn't trying to kill, he never tried to kill, but he also wasn't holding back the way he usually did in training. These were real villains trying to murder his teacher and his classmates, and that meant they got the full force of the winter spirit. A villain with metal manipulation tried to impale him with steel rods. Izuku froze them mid-flight and shattered them with a gesture. Someone with a strength-enhancing quirk charged him. Izuku let them get close, then touched their chest with one finger, and ice spread across their entire body in an instant. A woman with a snake mutation tried to bite him. He created an ice barrier between them and then swept it forward, knocking her back into 3 other villains. It should have been terrifying, this display of overwhelming power, this casual domination of dozens of experienced criminals. But Izuku was laughing, genuinely enjoying himself, treating the entire fight like a game that just happened to have deadly stakes. And that laughter, combined with his eternal smile, was somehow more frightening than any serious combat face could have been. Shigaraki noticed. Of course he noticed. The villain leader's red eyes tracked Izuku's movement with increasing frustration, watching this white-haired boy dismantle his carefully gathered forces like they were nothing. "Who the hell is that?" Shigaraki muttered to Kurogiri, scratching at his neck harder. "He's not supposed to be here. He's not in the data. Why is some ice brat so strong?" "Unknown," Kurogiri replied, mist swirling anxiously. His quirk appears to be cold manipulation, possibly with flight capabilities, but the level of power he's displaying is far beyond what we anticipated for first-year students. "Then we use the Nomu," Shigaraki decided, gesturing toward the massive creature that had been standing silently in the shadows. "Kill the ice brat first, then Eraserhead, then we wait for All Might. Nomu, destroy him." The creature moved, and Izuku's danger sense screamed at him a second before the massive fist crashed down where he'd been standing. He rode a wind current straight up, narrowly avoiding the strike that cratered the ground, and got his first good look at the thing they'd sent after him. The Nomu was huge, muscular, with exposed brain matter and dead eyes. It radiated wrongness, something unnatural and twisted, a perversion of what a living thing should be. And when it jumped, moving with speed that should have been impossible for something that size, Izuku realized this was a different level of threat entirely. He blocked the Nomu's punch with a hastily created ice wall, but the creature smashed through permafrost like it was regular ice, its strength so tremendous it overcame even winter's absolute defense through sheer force. Izuku dodged the follow-up strike, creating distance, reassessing. "Shock absorption," he muttered, seeing the way the Nomu's flesh rippled when it moved. "Super strength. Probably super regeneration too, if they've made it specifically to fight All Might. This thing is designed to be unkillable." "Smart boy," Shigaraki called from the sidelines, still scratching his neck. "But being smart won't save you. Nomu has been modified to withstand anything All Might can throw at it. Your ice tricks won't work." Izuku's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold, colder than the ice he created, colder than the winter winds he rode. "You came to my school," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. "You attacked my teachers, you threatened my friends, and you think ice tricks are all I can do?" He rose higher into the air, staff extended, and the temperature began to drop. Not just around him, everywhere. The entire central plaza started to freeze, frost spreading across surfaces, moisture in the air crystallizing into visible snow. The Nomu jumped after him, impossibly high, and Izuku met it mid-air with his staff, striking the creature's chest. The Nomu's shock absorption handled the physical impact easily, distributing the force harmlessly, but it couldn't absorb cold. The frost spread from the point of contact, racing across the Nomu's exposed flesh, seeping into its tissues, freezing the moisture in its cells. The creature roared, a horrible, mindless sound, and fell back to earth, ice beginning to coat its body. Shock absorption doesn't work against temperature, Izuku explained, descending slightly but staying airborne, watching the Nomu struggle. Your cells still freeze, your blood still turns solid, your tissues still become brittle. It's not an impact, it's a state change. He was showing off now, explaining his tactics because he wanted these villains to understand exactly how outmatched they were. That wanted them to feel the same helplessness his teachers and classmates had felt when they were attacked. The Nomu broke free of the ice through sheer strength, regenerating the frozen tissues, but Izuku was already moving again, flying circles around the creature at high speed, pelting it with ice bolts that froze different parts of its body. The Nomu couldn't touch him. Every time it jumped, Izuku was somewhere else, riding winds that shifted and changed unpredictably. Every time it landed, more ice spread, making footing treacherous, slowing its movements. And Izuku kept laughing, that bright, cheerful sound that made Shigaraki's eye twitch with rage. "You're trying to kill my teachers?" Izuku said, his voice still playful despite the deadly combat. "And I can't let that happen, so let's have some fun." He dove straight at the Nomu, staff first, moving faster than he ever had in training, and struck the creature's head with all the force he could channel through winter winds. The impact would have shattered concrete, but the Nomu's shock absorption handled it easily, distributing the force harmlessly through its body. But Izuku wasn't trying to hurt it with impact. The moment his staff connected, he released everything. All the cold he'd been gathering, all the winter power he'd been holding back, every bit of frost and freeze, and absolute zero chill that the winter spirit could generate. The Nomu's shock absorption tissues tried to distribute it, and that was exactly what Izuku wanted. The cold spread through the Nomu's entire body instantly, following the same pathways the shock absorption used to distribute impacts. The creature froze from the inside out, its cells crystallizing, its blood turning to ice, its enhanced muscles becoming brittle and useless. It tried to regenerate, but regeneration required cellular activity, and cells couldn't function at these temperatures. The Nomu became a statue, a massive ice sculpture of twisted humanity, frozen solid and completely immobilized. Izuku landed on top of its frozen head, staff planted like a flag, breathing heavily but still smiling. The entire fight had taken maybe 2 minutes from start to finish. Shigaraki stared, his scratching intensifying until he drew blood. "Impossible," he muttered. "That's impossible. The Nomu was designed to fight all might. It can't be beaten by some first-year student. This wasn't supposed to happen. This ruins everything." "Sometimes plans change," Izuku said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet plaza. The other villains had stopped fighting, staring at their supposedly invincible weapon frozen solid beneath this white-haired boy's feet. "You should probably leave now, before All Might shows up and makes things worse for you." As if summoned by his words, the doors to the facility burst open, and the symbol of peace himself arrived, taking in the scene with wide eyes. Dozens of frozen villains, his injured student Aizawa, and Izuku standing atop the Nomu like some winter deity passing judgment. "I am here," All Might declared, then paused, clearly confused by the situation. "And apparently, not needed?" "Better late than never," Izuku called cheerfully, hopping down from the frozen Nomu. "Though we've got things pretty well handled. Aizawa needs medical attention, and there's a villain over there with a teleportation quirk who might escape if you don't grab him soon." All Might moved with his trademark speed, securing Kurogiri before the mist villain could open a portal. Shigaraki, seeing his plan completely destroyed, could only scratch his neck and stare at Izuku with pure hatred. "This isn't over," the villain leader hissed. "I don't know what you are, Winter Boy, but you've made an enemy today. The League of Villains doesn't forget." "Neither does Winter," Izuku replied, his smile finally fading into something colder and more dangerous. "And Winter is patient. I can wait as long as it takes." Police and medical teams arrived within minutes, flooding the facility, securing the frozen villains, treating injured students and teachers. Izuku gave his statement calmly, explaining what happened, how he'd neutralized the threats, why he'd engaged instead of retreating. The officers seemed torn between praising his heroic actions and reprimanding him for the risk he'd taken. All Might pulled him aside after the official interviews, his muscular form seeming smaller somehow, more worried than triumphant. "Young Midoriya," the hero said quietly, "what you did today was incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. You saved lives, Aizawa's, your classmates, possibly dozens of others. But you also faced villains far beyond what a student should handle. I need to know, are you all right?" Izuku considered the question seriously, looking down at his bare feet, at the frost still clinging to his staff, at the way the spring sunlight felt wrong against his pale skin. "I'm fine," he said finally, and it was mostly true. "I did what needed doing. That's what heroes do, right?" "Heroes also know when to retreat," All Might countered gently. "They don't face overwhelming odds alone." "I wasn't alone," Izuku pointed out, gesturing to where Aizawa was being loaded into an ambulance. "My teacher was there. I couldn't leave him." All Might was silent for a moment, studying him with those blue eyes that seemed to see more than Izuku wanted to reveal. "You remind me of someone," the hero said finally. "The way you smiled through that whole fight, the way you treated it like a game even while defending your friends. It's not normal, Midoriya. It's not healthy to find joy in combat the way you do." "Joy is what makes me strong," Izuku replied, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, just simple truth. The Winter Spirit's power grows with happiness, with fun, with the desire to protect. If I'd been serious and scared, I would have been weaker, so I smiled and laughed, and I won. "The Winter Spirit?" All Might repeated, confused. Izuku realized he'd said more than he meant to and backtracked quickly. "Just what I call my quirk, because it feels like winter lives inside me, like I'm carrying cold and ice and snow wherever I go. It's not really, it's complicated." He didn't explain about Jack Frost, about the lake, about the transformation that had changed him from a normal boy into something else entirely. Those secrets were his own, buried deep beneath layers of ice and smiles, and he wasn't ready to share them even with the symbol of peace. The school closed for a week after the USJ attack, giving students time to recover and the administration time to investigate how villains had infiltrated their facility. Izuku spent the break practicing with his staff, pushing his powers further, seeing what else the Winter Spirit could do. He could create weather now, summon actual blizzards that affected areas measured in kilometers. He could sense winter approaching from weeks away, feel temperature changes across entire cities. His ice constructs had become sophisticated enough to build functional buildings, and he'd started experimenting with creating lifelike sculptures that almost seemed alive. But the power came with increasing isolation. The colder he became, the more powerful his magic grew, the harder it was to connect with people who lived in warmth. He couldn't hold hands without numbing fingers, couldn't share body heat, couldn't participate in normal physical affection without causing discomfort. Even his friends who genuinely liked him maintained a careful distance, unconsciously avoiding skin contact. Only Todoroki seemed unbothered, his own temperature regulation making Izuku's cold feel almost normal. They spent hours together during the break, training in private, sharing techniques and strategies. Todoroki showed Izuku his ice formations, and Izuku showed Todoroki how to make his ice unbreakable, how to infuse it with enough cold that heat couldn't overcome it. "You're not using your fire," Izuku observed during one session, watching Todoroki create a massive glacier using only his right side. "Still refusing because of your father?" "It's his power," Todoroki replied, his voice flat. "I won't use it. I'll become the #1 hero using only ice, proving I don't need his flames." Izuku understood that kind of stubbornness, that determination to prove something fundamental about yourself. But he also saw how it limited Todoroki, how the boy was handicapping himself out of spite, cutting his potential in half because of familial resentment. You know, Izuku said carefully, creating a small flame of ice, a paradoxical sculpture that looked like fire but was made entirely of frozen water. Power isn't about where it comes from. It's about what you do with it. Your fire is yours, whether your father gave you the genes or not. You choosing not to use it doesn't hurt him. It only hurts you. Todoroki stared at the ice flame, something shifting in his expression. You don't understand. My father created you through a forced marriage to breed the perfect hero, Izuku interrupted, his voice gentle despite the harsh words. Used you as a tool, trained you like an object, scarred your mother, and drove her to hurt you out of desperation and pain. I know, Todoroki. I know all of it because you told me. And I'm not saying forgive him. I'm saying don't let him control you by refusing to be your whole self. The ice flame melted in Izuku's palm, becoming water, becoming nothing. Your fire isn't his. It's yours. And you're allowed to use it, allowed to be happy with it, allowed to be whole. That's not giving in. That's taking back control. Todoroki looked at him for a long moment, heterochromatic eyes searching Izuku's crystalline blue ones, and something cracked in his careful composure. How did you get so wise about loneliness and power? He asked quietly. Experience, Izuku answered, just as quietly. I've been alone a long time, Todoroki. I know what it's like to cut parts of yourself off because you think they make you weak or wrong or too connected to painful memories. But I also know that those parts are still you, whether you use them or not. You can't escape yourself by pretending half of you doesn't exist. When classes resumed, the sports festival was announced, a massive public event where students would demonstrate their abilities in front of professional heroes, media, and the entire country. It was UA's way of showing that despite the villain attack, their students were strong and capable and ready to become the next generation of heroes. Izuku watched the announcement with mild interest, not particularly concerned about the competition aspect. He'd never been driven by the need to prove himself superior to others. That was Bakugo's motivation, not his. But he understood that the sports festival was an opportunity to be seen, to show pro heroes what the winter spirit could do, to maybe find someone who would understand that his power wasn't just destruction, wasn't just combat, but joy and magic and the pure delight of winter. The festival began with an obstacle race, all first-year students competing simultaneously to determine who would advance to the next round. Present Mike's voice boomed across the stadium, explaining the rules, building hype for the massive crowd that had gathered to watch. Start! The gate opened, and students poured out in a chaotic mass. Quirks activating, everyone jostling for position. Izuku waited, letting them run ahead, watching the chaos with his eternal smile. Then, when the path had cleared slightly, he tapped his staff on the ground and rode a wind current straight up, flying over the entire crowd, white hair catching stadium lights, frost trailing behind him like a comet's tail. The crowd went silent for a moment, watching this barefoot boy soar through the air with casual grace, and then erupted into cheers. Present Mike's commentary became nearly incoherent. Is that allowed? Can he just fly over the obstacles? That's technically not against the rules. Midoriya Izuku from Class 1A is taking an early lead. The first obstacle was robot enemies from the entrance exam, massive machines blocking the narrow path. Students were fighting them, destroying them with quirks, slowly making progress. Izuku flew over all of it, not even bothering to engage, and touched down on the other side to conserve energy for later challenges. The second obstacle was a massive chasm crossed by tight ropes. Most students were carefully balancing across using their quirks for stability. Izuku just rode wind currents across the gap, not touching the ropes at all. The third obstacle was a minefield, and this one was actually interesting because flying over it would trigger the mines. Izuku landed at the edge and studied the field, seeing the slight variations in ground color that indicated mine placement. He could freeze a path through, create ice bridges that distributed his weight, move fast enough that the mines couldn't lock onto him before he was past. Instead, he did something unexpected. He tapped his staff on the ground and snow began to fall. Actual snow, from clear skies, defying weather and season. The snow landed on the minefield, and wherever it touched, the mines froze solid, their triggering mechanisms becoming too cold to function properly. Izuku walked through the field barefoot, snow falling around him like a winter blessing, and didn't trigger a single explosion because all the mines in his path were frozen inactive. He crossed the finish line first, by a significant margin, and the crowd's cheers were deafening. Present Mike was practically screaming into his microphone. Midoriya Izuku finishes first with a display of quirk mastery that's frankly unfair. Flying, weather control, precision freezing. This first year is a powerhouse. Other students finished gradually. Todoroki second, using his ice to slide through obstacles. Bakugo third, exploding his way through challenges with typical aggression. The top 42 students advanced to the next round, which turned out to be a cavalry battle. Teams of 4 competing to steal headbands worth different point values, with the first place finisher from the obstacle race wearing a band worth 10 million points. Every team would be gunning for Izuku. Every student would see him as the primary target, the one to beat, the prize to claim. It should have been terrifying. Being marked like that, having everyone in the stadium focused on taking him down. Izuku smiled and started looking for teammates. Uraraka joined immediately, her gravity quirk perfect for mobility. Tokoyami contributed Dark Shadow for defense. And to everyone's surprise, Izuku asked a pink-haired girl from the support department named Hatsume Mei, whose invention-focused quirk could provide equipment advantages. "I have just the thing," Hatsume declared, pulling out devices that look like hover boots. These babies use magnetic propulsion to... "Not necessary," Izuku interrupted gently, "but I like your enthusiasm. Can you make something that generates heat? Enough to counteract cold temperatures?" Hatsume's eyes lit up with the manic glee of an inventor given a challenge. "Oh, absolutely. I've been working on thermal regulators that could..." The cavalry battle began, and chaos erupted immediately. Every team charged Izuku's position, trying to grab the 10 million point headband. But Uraraka made their entire team weightless, and Izuku lifted them all on a wind current, flying above the battlefield, completely untouchable. Teams tried jumping after them, tried throwing things, tried using ranged quirks, but nothing could reach them. Tokoyami's Dark Shadow blocked projectiles, Uraraka's gravity manipulation let them maneuver in 3 dimensions, and Izuku's wind control gave them speed and altitude no ground-based team could match. It wasn't even fair. They flew circles around the stadium. It sucked, occasionally descending to steal headbands from other teams just to make things interesting, then rising back out of reach before anyone could retaliate. Izuku was laughing the entire time, genuinely enjoying the absurdity of flying cavalry battle, the looks of frustration from teams who couldn't touch them, the crowd's mixed reactions of amazement and protest. "This is completely broken," Present Mike shouted. "Midoriya's team is untouchable. They're just flying around up there like they're on a field trip." Bakugo's team tried the hardest, using his explosions to rocket himself upward, grabbing for the headband with furious determination. Izuku let him get close, closer than was safe, then created an ice platform beneath them, and when Bakugo landed on it, the platform dissolved, sending him falling back to Earth while Izuku's team rose higher. "Nice try," Izuku called down, waving cheerfully, and Bakugo's scream of rage could be heard across the entire stadium. When time ran out, Izuku's team still had their 10 million points, plus several others they'd collected for fun. They descended to the ground victorious, and Uraraka was bouncing with excitement, while Hatsume was already planning modifications to her inventions. Based on the battle data, the final round was announced. One-on-one tournament matches, bracketed randomly, broadcast live to the entire nation. Izuku checked his bracket and saw his path. First round against someone named Hitoshi Shinso. Later rounds potentially against Todoroki, possibly Bakugo in the finals if they both advanced. The tournament began. Matches played out one after another, each student giving their all, some advancing, some eliminated. Izuku watched with interest, analyzing quirks and fighting styles, seeing how his classmates had grown since the school year began. His match with Shinso was strange. The purple-haired boy had a brainwashing quirk activated by verbal response, and he tried to provoke Izuku into speaking. But Izuku had been warned by other students, knew the trick, and simply refused to engage verbally. He created an ice wall between them, then pushed it forward with wind, forcing Shinso out of bounds without ever saying a word. After the match, when they were off the arena floor, Izuku found Shinso in the hallway. "Your quirk is incredible," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you it's villainous. Control and influence are just as heroic as strength or speed when used properly." Shinso looked surprised, then grateful, and some of the bitterness faded from his expression. "Thanks," he muttered. "Most people just call me creepy." "Most people are idiots," Izuku replied with his usual smile and walked away, leaving Shinso staring after him with something like hope in his eyes. The matches continued. Izuku advanced easily through his bracket, fighting efficiently but never cruelly, always showing respect for his opponents, even as he defeated them. And finally, inevitably, he reached the semifinals. His opponent was Todoroki Shoto. They stood across from each other in the stadium, the crowd silent with anticipation. Two ice users about to clash, two students who understood loneliness and power about to test everything they'd learned. Midnight, the referee raised her hand to signal the start. "Begin." Todoroki opened with a massive glacier, ice erupting from his right side with devastating force, trying to freeze Izuku in place and end the fight immediately. It was his standard overwhelming tactic, the move that had crushed every previous opponent. Izuku rode the wind over it effortlessly, rising above the ice and called down, "Come on, you're not even trying! Where's your fire?" Todoroki's expression tightened and he created another glacier, then another, filling the arena with ice formations that should have been impossible to dodge. But Izuku moved through them like he was dancing, weaving between frozen spires, touching down on ice surfaces that should have been too slippery to stand on, completely at home in the winter wonderland Todoroki had created. "You're holding back," Izuku shouted, landing briefly before launching himself away from another ice blast. "You're handicapping yourself because of your father, and it's making you weaker. Use everything you have. I don't need his fire." Todoroki shot back, creating a wall of ice. "I'll win with my mother's power alone." "It's not your mother's power," Izuku countered. And now there was an edge to his voice, frustration breaking through the playful facade. "It's not your father's fire. It's yours, Todoroki. Your quirk. Your quirk, your power, your choice. Stop letting endeavor control you by refusing to be whole." He created his own ice, permafrost rising to meet Todoroki's glacier, and when they collided, Izuku's ice won, colder and stronger, pushing Todoroki's formation back. The crowd gasped, seeing this direct comparison of ice quirks, seeing Izuku's prove superior. "You're allowed to be happy," Izuku continued, advancing across his own ice, staff in hand. "You're allowed to use every part of yourself. That's not giving in. That's taking back control. Your father can't control fire that you choose to use for your own purposes." Todoroki stumbled, ice formation faltering, and Izuku saw tears freezing on his left cheek, the side he never used. "I can't," Todoroki whispered. "If I use it, I become what he wanted. I become his perfect creation." "No," Izuku said gently, stopping his advance. "If you use it, you become yourself, complete, whole, free." He raised his staff and did something he'd never done before in combat. Created warmth. Not heat. He couldn't generate actual heat. But the memory of warmth, the feeling of it, captured an ice that glowed like fire, that radiated psychological comfort despite its cold temperature. He threw it toward Todoroki, not to hurt, just to show. And when it landed at the boy's feet, something in Todoroki's expression cracked completely. Fire bloomed on his left side, hesitant at first, then stronger, burning away the psychological ice that had trapped it for so long. The temperature in the stadium spiked dramatically, and Present Mike's commentary became nearly incoherent with excitement. "Todoroki is using his fire! After an entire tournament of ice-only combat, he's finally using both sides of his quirk. This changes everything." Todoroki looked at his burning hand, then at Izuku and smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time Izuku had ever seen. "Thank you," he said quietly, and Izuku knew he meant for more than just the match, more than just the tournament. Thank you for seeing him, for understanding, for caring enough to push. "Now show me," Izuku said, settling into a combat stance, staff ready, smile bright. "Show me what you can do when you stop holding back." Todoroki created a massive wave of ice, then immediately melted it with fire, creating a wall of steam that filled the arena. He used the cover to move, creating ice paths and fire blasts, combining his two sides in ways he'd never attempted before. And Izuku met him move for move, freezing the steam, creating wind currents that cleared sight lines, riding the air above the battlefield with the grace of someone born to fly. They clashed in the center of the arena, ice against ice, wind against fire, two lonely boys who'd found understanding in each other now testing their absolute limits. The crowd was on its feet, screaming, watching what might have been the best first-year match in sports festival history. Todoroki created a massive pillar of ice and fire combined, a towering formation that radiated both hot and cold, showing mastery over both elements. It was beautiful, powerful, proof that he'd finally accepted himself, and Izuku responded by summoning a blizzard. Real winter descended on the stadium, snow falling in sheets, temperature plummeting, wind howling like wolves. Izuku rose into the air at the center of his storm, staff glowing with accumulated power, white hair whipping in winds he controlled, and for just a moment, he let everyone see what the winter spirit truly was. Not just a boy with an ice quirk, but something older, something magical, something that belonged to legends and fairy tales more than the modern world of heroes. The blizzard concentrated, becoming a localized tornado of snow and ice, and Izuku directed it at Todoroki's fire-ice formation. The two attacks met with a detonation of steam and force that shook the stadium, and when the mist cleared, both students were standing, exhausted, pushed to their absolute limits. But Todoroki's flames were flickering, his ice formation crumbling, while Izuku was still airborne, still smiling, still looking like he could fight for hours more. "I yield," Todoroki said suddenly, his voice carrying across the silent arena. "I can't beat you, Midoriya. Not today. Maybe not ever. But thank you for helping me remember that it's okay to try." The crowd erupted and Midnight declared Izuku the winner, and as he descended from his winter winds, Izuku walked to Todoroki and offered his cold hand. Todoroki took it without hesitation, not flinching from the ice, and they stood there in the settling snow, two students who'd started as strangers and become something more through understanding and conflict and mutual loneliness. "You'll beat me someday," Izuku said quietly. "When you've had more time to practice with both sides, when you're completely comfortable with all your power, I'm looking forward to it." Todoroki nodded, still smiling that small, genuine smile, and they walked off the arena floor together, the crowd cheering for both of them. The final match was against Bakugo, who'd advanced through his own bracket with explosive efficiency. They stood across from each other in an arena that still had frost from Izuku's previous battle, and Bakugo's expression was pure determination, mixed with something that might have been fear. "I'm gonna beat you," Bakugo declared. "I don't care about your permafrost or your flying or your winter bullshit. I'm stronger and I'm going to prove it." "Okay," Izuku replied simply, still smiling. "Show me." The match began, and Bakugo came at him with everything he had, explosions so powerful they should have ended the fight in seconds. But Izuku's permafrost held, creating barriers that didn't crack, didn't melt, didn't give ground no matter how much heat Bakugo threw at them. And between defenses, Izuku attacked, ice bolts and wind blasts and frozen platforms that made Bakugo's footing treacherous. They fought for 10 minutes, Bakugo pushing himself beyond every limit, using techniques Izuku had never seen, combining explosions in creative ways that showed real tactical growth. But it wasn't enough. It could never be enough, because winter doesn't burn, and Izuku's power existed in opposition to everything Bakugo represented. Finally, exhausted and frustrated and refusing to give up despite obvious defeat, Bakugo made one last desperate charge. Izuku let him get close, then tapped his staff against Bakugo's chest gently. Just a touch, nothing harmful, and ice spread across the explosive boy's body, not freezing him solid, just creating enough frost to make him unable to use his quirk properly. "I win," Izuku said softly, without triumph, without gloating. "You fought well, Bakugo, better than I expected. But today, winter was stronger." Bakugo stood there frozen mid-strike, tears of frustration freezing on his face, and Izuku saw something break in his rival's expression. Not his spirit, exactly, but his absolute certainty that he was the strongest, that he would always be the strongest, that victory was his birthright. Midnight declared Izuku the winner of the sports festival, and the crowd's cheers were deafening, and All Might descended to award him the first-place medal. But Izuku barely heard it, too focused on Bakugo's expression, on the way his rival looked small and defeated and lost. After the ceremony, after the crowds dispersed and the media stopped asking questions and the students began to leave, Izuku found Bakugo sitting alone in the locker room, still in his torn and frost-damaged gym clothes, staring at nothing. "You know what the difference between us is?" Izuku asked, sitting beside him without asking permission, staff propped between his knees. "It's not power. You're incredibly strong, Bakugo, strong enough to be a great hero someday." "Then what?" Bakugo asked bitterly, not looking at him. "Joy," Izuku answered simply. "I fight because it's fun, because using my powers makes me happy, because protecting people gives me purpose. You fight because you're angry, because you need to prove something, because winning is how you define yourself. And anger burns out faster than happiness. That's why I won." Bakugo was silent for a long moment, processing that, and then, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." But there was no real venom in his voice, just exhaustion, and Izuku took that as progress. The weeks after the sports festival brought change. Pro heroes had watched the matches, seen what Izuku could do, and internship offers flooded in from agencies across the country. But Izuku chose a small hero agency run by an underground hero named Manuel, who worked in water rescue and seemed genuinely interested in helping Izuku refine his control, rather than just using his power for flashy victories. The internship was educational, if not exciting. Lots of patrol work, lots of practice with precision freezing, lots of discussions about hero philosophy and responsibility. Manuel was patient and thoughtful, and he noticed things about Izuku that others missed. "You're lonely," the hero observed one evening after patrol, watching Izuku create frost patterns on a window. "I can see it in the way you interact with people. You're friendly, but there's distance there. Like you're performing being normal instead of actually feeling it." Izuku's hands stilled, frost pattern half complete. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone looking," Manuel replied. "Most people see the smile and the jokes and assume you're fine. But I've been doing this long enough to recognize when someone's hurting underneath their hero mask. You want to talk about it?" And somehow, sitting in this small hero agency with someone who'd shown genuine care, Izuku found himself talking. Really talking, for the first time in years. He explained about the lake, about Jack Frost, about the fundamental coldness that separated him from everyone else, about being seen but not known, about the loneliness that came from bringing joy to others while feeling empty yourself. Manuel listened without judgment, and when Izuku finished, the hero was quiet for a while before responding. "Being a hero isn't about being invulnerable," he said finally. "It's about being strong enough to help others despite your own pain. You're carrying something heavy, Midoriya. That's obvious, but you're using it to bring joy and safety to people. That's admirable. Just don't lose yourself in the process." The internship ended, and Izuku returned to UA changed in subtle ways. He was still playful, still smiled constantly, still treated combat like a game. But there was a new awareness underneath, a recognition that hiding pain didn't make it disappear, that loneliness acknowledged was easier to bear than loneliness denied. Summer arrived, hot and miserable, and Izuku spent most of his time in the dorm's common room, which he'd essentially turned into a winter zone. His classmates adapted, wearing sweaters when they visited, accepting that being around Izuku meant being cold. Some of them even started to enjoy it, appreciating the escape from summer heat. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, connections formed. Real connections, not the surface-level friendships he'd maintained before. Uraraka learned to hold his hand despite the cold, her gravity quirk somehow making the temperature difference less jarring. Ida started studying winter weather patterns to better understand how Izuku's powers worked. Ashido dragged him to movie nights and refused to let him sit alone in corners. Even Bakugo, in his own explosive way, started treating their rivalry less like hatred and more like genuine competition between equals. Todoroki remained his closest friend, the one person who truly understood what it meant to be separated by power, to carry burdens that others couldn't see. They trained together constantly, ice against fire and ice, winter against seasons, and gradually, Todoroki grew stronger, more confident, more whole. And then, December arrived, and with it, the holiday season. The school had increased security after the USJ attack. which meant students couldn't go home for winter break. They were locked in the dorms, safe but isolated, missing their families during what should have been a time of celebration and connection. The mood in the common room was melancholy. Students sitting in small groups, looking at phones with family photos, trying to stay cheerful but clearly struggling. Izuku watched from his usual corner, staff in hand, feeling the winter outside calling to him, and made a decision. Late on Christmas Eve, when most students had retreated to their rooms to deal with homesickness privately, Izuku walked to the center of the common room and closed his eyes. He'd been holding back all semester, keeping his power contained, never showing the full extent of what the winter spirit could do. But tonight, Christmas Eve, with his friends sad and missing their families, he decided to give them a gift. He released everything. Snow began falling indoors, gentle and magical, flakes appearing from nowhere, drifting down with the impossible beauty that only winter magic could create. The temperature dropped, not uncomfortably, but perfectly. That ideal winter wonderland cold that made you want to bundle up and drink hot chocolate and watch snowfall. Frost spread across windows in patterns that looked like living art, like the windows themselves had become canvases for some master artist. Izuku opened his eyes, staff glowing with accumulated power, and began to create. Ice sculptures formed throughout the common room, life-sized and perfect, based on photos he'd secretly studied over the past months. He created Uraraka's parents, their kind faces rendered in crystalline detail. He made Ida's brother Tensei, captured in ice before his injury. He crafted Ashido's whole family, their unique appearances perfect down to the last detail. He created Bakugo's parents, his mother's aggressive stance, his father's mild expression, and even captured Todoroki's family as they should have been, whole and happy, unbroken by Endeavor's ambition. Every student's family appeared in ice, not morbid or creepy, but beautiful, like loving ghosts watching over their children. The sculptures caught the light and reflected it in rainbow patterns, seeming almost alive, almost real. Izuku created an aurora on the ceiling, colors dancing and shifting in patterns that defied physics, filling the room with ethereal light. He conjured an ice Christmas tree that glowed from within, perfect branches laden with frost ornaments that chimed like bells when touched. He made the floor into black ice so smooth and perfect that walking felt like gliding, but textured enough that no one would slip. The entire common room transformed into something from a fairy tale, a winter paradise that felt more real than reality, and students began emerging from their rooms one by one, by the sound of falling snow, by the sudden drop in temperature, by the sense that something magical was happening. They stood in the doorway and stared, speechless, taking in the indoor blizzard, the ice sculptures of their families, the aurora lights, the impossible beauty of it all. Uraraka started crying first, seeing her parents rendered in ice, looking like they were just about to speak. Then Ida, his hand reaching toward his brother's sculpture. Then others, one after another, overcome by emotion. Ashido laughed and cried simultaneously, touching her ice family with trembling fingers. Tokoyami stood beneath the aurora with dark shadow manifested, both of them silent with wonder. Even Bakugo, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, stared at his ice parents with an expression softer than Izuku had ever seen on his face. And Todoroki, walking through the snow to stand beside Izuku, looked at the sculpture of his family, whole, happy, unbroken, and smiled that genuine smile Izuku had first seen during their sports festival match. "Thank you," he whispered, and Izuku knew he meant for more than just the ice sculpture. "Merry Christmas," Izuku replied, his voice soft, his eternal smile finally genuinely warm. Nobody should be alone during the holidays. Students gathered in small groups around their ice families, sharing stories, laughing through tears, pointing out details Izuku had captured perfectly. The common room filled with voices and emotion and a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with connection, with being seen, with magic that reminded them why they'd chosen to become heroes in the first place. Izuku stood at the center of his winter wonderland, barefoot in the snow he'd created, staff in hand, white hair glowing in aurora light, and for the first time since that day in the lake 11 years ago, he didn't feel lonely. He was surrounded by people who saw him, not just the winter spirit, not just the powerful ice user, but Izuku Midoriya himself. People who appreciated what he could do but valued who he was. Bakugo approached eventually, stopping beside him with hands shoved in pockets, staring at the ice sculpture of his own parents. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but there was no anger in his voice. "You made a winter theme park in our dorm." "Do you like it?" Izuku asked, genuinely curious. Bakugo was silent for a long moment, then, "Yeah, I do. It's good. Whatever." Coming from Bakugo, that was practically a heartfelt declaration of gratitude. They stood together in the falling snow, rivals who'd become something more complicated through combat and competition and grudging respect. Around them, Class 1A celebrated Christmas Eve in a winter wonderland, and Izuku's smile, that eternal expression that usually hid so much pain, was completely genuine. He wasn't alone anymore. He'd found people who saw him, who knew him, who valued him for more than just his power. The winter spirit had finally found a place to belong, and it felt like coming home after a long, cold journey through an empty world. The snow continued to fall, gentle and magical, and aurora lights danced overhead, and for one perfect night, the future heroes of Class 1A were just teenagers experiencing the joy of winter, of friendship, of being together. And Izuku Midoriya, the boy who died and been reborn as Jack Frost's reincarnation, stood at the center of it all and felt, for the first time in 11 years, genuinely warm. The warmth didn't come from external heat. The common room was still freezing, snow still falling in gentle patterns from a ceiling that shouldn't produce weather. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere he'd thought had frozen solid that winter day in the lake. Watching his classmates move between ice sculptures of their families, seeing tears and laughter mixed together, hearing voices filled with gratitude and wonder, Izuku felt something shift in the permafrost that had surrounded his heart for so long. Ashido was dancing with her ice family. Humming a tune Izuku had heard her play from her phone, treating the frozen replicas like they were really there. Tokoyami stood beneath the aurora with his eyes closed. Dark shadow manifested beside him, both of them basking in the ethereal light. Uraraka had brought her phone over to photograph her ice parents from every angle, tears streaming down her face but smiling so bright it hurt to look at. And Todoroki, standing beside Izuku in the falling snow, was touching his ice family with trembling fingers, tracing the faces of siblings he rarely saw. A mother who was healing, a father who, in this frozen moment, looked kind instead of cruel. The sculpture showed what could be, not what was, and Todoroki seemed to understand that Izuku had given him hope rendered in crystalline form. "Thank you," Todoroki said again, his voice barely above a whisper, and Izuku saw something glistening in his heterochromatic eyes that had nothing to do with ice and everything to do with emotion finally allowed to surface. "Everyone deserves to see their family on Christmas," Izuku replied, keeping his tone light despite the weight of feeling in his chest. "Even if it's just frozen water shaped like memories." "It's more than that," Todoroki insisted, finally looking away from the sculpture to meet Izuku's crystalline blue eyes. "You made them whole. You showed me what my family could look like if we all healed, if my father changed, if we learned to be together again. That's not just ice. That's hope." Izuku wanted to deflect, to make a joke, to smile his usual playful smile and change the subject. But Todoroki's expression was too open, too vulnerable, and this moment felt too important to diminish with his usual deflections. So instead, he just nodded and let the gratitude settle between them like fresh snow. The night stretched on, students eventually retreating to their rooms, but leaving the common room transformed. The winter wonderland still maintained by Izuku's constant low-level power output. He stood alone after everyone had gone, maintaining the magic because he could, because keeping the ice sculptures standing meant his friends would wake up to this gift again, because for once his power was bringing joy instead of isolation. He didn't sleep. The winter spirit rarely needed sleep, sustained by cold and magic and something older than rest. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the frozen floor, staff across his knees, watching aurora lights dance on the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of indoor snow falling, feeling the presence of his sleeping classmates in rooms above and around him. For the first time in 11 years, he didn't feel alone in the quiet hours before dawn. Morning came, gradually. Pale winter sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows, and Izuku heard movement from the upper floors, students waking, doors opening. He stood and stretched, bare feet finding purchase on black ice, and waited for their reactions when they came downstairs and found the winter wonderland still there. Kirishima was first, stumbling into the common room with messy red hair and sleep-heavy eyes, and he stopped dead when he saw the scene unchanged from the night before. "Dude," he breathed, staring at the ice sculptures, the falling snow, the aurora lights that should have been impossible. "You kept it going all night?" Izuku shrugged, leaning on his staff with affected casualness. Didn't have anything better to do, besides seemed wrong to let it melt after one evening. Other students filtered in gradually, each one stopping to take in the maintained magic, and Izuku saw something shift in how they looked at him. Not fear exactly, not even awe, but recognition that he'd done this for them, that he'd spent the entire night maintaining a spell that brought them comfort, that his power wasn't just for combat or showing off, but for creating beauty and connection. Uraraka floated down the stairs instead of walking, her gravity quirk making her descent graceful, and she went straight to Izuku and hugged him, despite the cold radiating from his body. He froze, no pun intended, unused to casual physical affection, but her arms stayed wrapped around him, even as frost formed on her sleeves. "Thank you," she said into his shoulder, voice muffled but clear. "Thank you for bringing my parents here, even if they're just ice. Thank you for making Christmas special when we all thought it would be lonely. Thank you for being you." Izuku's arms rose slowly, hesitantly, returning the embrace with careful gentleness, terrified of freezing her but unable to pull away from the warmth, metaphorical warmth, of genuine affection offered without reservation. "You're welcome," he managed, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, rougher than usual, like something had lodged in his throat. She pulled back after a moment, rubbing her arms to restore circulation, but her smile was bright and genuine. "Next time, warn me before you create indoor winter wonderlands so I can bring better clothes." "Where's the fun in that?" Izuku replied, his playful tone returning, and she laughed and floated away to examine her ice parents again. The day passed in lazy holiday contentment, students lounging in the transformed common room, some studying, some playing games, some just sitting and talking while snow fell around them. Izuku maintained the magic effortlessly, his power so vast that this level of output barely registered as strain, and he found himself part of conversations instead of observing from the margins. Ida organized a winter-themed movie marathon, somehow finding films about snow and ice and seasonal magic, and insisted everyone participate. They ended up crowded onto couches and chairs and floor cushions, wrapped in blankets to ward off the cold, watching stories about winter spirits and magical ice queens and heroes who fought in snow. Izuku sat between Todoroki and Tokoyami, staff propped against the couch arm, and felt something dangerously close to contentment. During a scene where the fictional Ice Queen learned to control her powers through love instead of fear, Todoroki leaned over and whispered, "That's you, you know? Learning that power doesn't have to isolate you, that it can bring people together instead." Izuku wanted to argue, to point out that he'd always known his power could bring joy, that the Winter Spirit's entire purpose was fun and wonder and magic. But looking around at his classmates laughing together in his indoor blizzard, at the ice sculptures standing like silent guardians, at the way everyone had adapted to the cold because being together was worth a little discomfort, he realized Todoroki was right. He'd created magic before, but he'd never created belonging. Not like this. Evening arrived, and the winter wonderland finally began to fade. Not because Izuku couldn't maintain it, he absolutely could, but because he sensed his classmates needed normalcy too. Needed the familiar warmth of their dorm, needed to not live in eternal winter, even if it was beautiful. The snow stopped falling first, flakes dissipating into nothing. Then the aurora lights dimmed gradually, and finally the ice sculptures began to melt, faces softening, details blurring, until they were just puddles of water that Izuku collected and froze into decorative orbs that students could keep as mementos. Ashido claimed hers immediately, holding the frozen sphere that contained a miniature version of her family, preserved in crystalline detail. "I'm keeping this forever," she declared. Nobody's allowed to touch my ice ball. That sounds vaguely inappropriate, Kaminari observed, and got smacked with a couch pillow for his trouble. The common room returned to normal temperatures, and students who'd been wearing winter clothes all day finally shed their extra layers. But the atmosphere had changed. There was closeness now that hadn't existed before, a sense of shared experience that bonded them beyond just being classmates. They'd spent Christmas together in a magical winter wonderland, and that memory would stay with them regardless of what happened next. Late that evening, after most students had retired to their rooms, Bakugo appeared in the common room doorway, hands shoved in pockets, his expression unreadable. Izuku was sitting on the couch, staff across his lap, not doing anything in particular, and he looked up when he sensed Bakugo's presence. "Hey," Izuku said carefully, uncertain what to expect. Bakugo had been quieter than usual all day, hadn't participated much in the movie marathon, had stayed on the edges of conversations like he was processing something. Bakugo grunted and walked into the room, dropping onto the couch opposite Izuku with his usual aggressive grace. They sat in silence for several long moments, the quiet stretching between them like fresh snow waiting for footprints. "That thing you did," Bakugo said finally, not looking at Izuku, staring instead at the wall where an ice sculpture had stood hours before. The whole Winter Wonderland bullshit, making everyone's families appear. That was... He trailed off, struggling with words, and Izuku waited patiently, knowing that pushing Bakugo never worked, that the explosive boy needed to arrive at his point in his own time. "That was the kind of thing heroes do," Bakugo finished quietly. "Not the flashy combat stuff, not the winning fights and looking cool. The quiet thing where you see people hurting and you fix it just because you can. That's what All Might does, what real heroes do." Izuku blinked, genuinely surprised by the admission. Bakugo never talked like this, never acknowledged heroism beyond strength and victory. This felt like character growth, like something fundamental had shifted in how his rival viewed the world. "I've been thinking," Bakugo continued, still not meeting Izuku's eyes, his jaw tight like forcing out these words physically hurt, "about why I can't beat you. Why no matter how hard I train, how strong I get, how many new techniques I develop, you're still ahead, and I figured it out." He finally looked at Izuku, red eyes intense, but no longer filled with the burning hatred that had defined their relationship for years. "You care," Bakugo said simply, "about people, about making them happy, about using your power for more than just winning. That's what makes you strong, not just the ice or the flying or the winter spirit bullshit. The fact that you genuinely want to help people, to bring them joy, to make the world better. And I..." He paused, swallowing hard, forcing out words that clearly didn't come easily. "I've been so focused on being the strongest, on proving I'm number one, that I forgot why we're supposed to want to be heroes in the first place. To help people, to save them, to make them feel safe and happy and protected. You've known that all along, and I'm just figuring it out now." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest in a way Bakugo had never been before. Izuku felt something shift in his chest, the ice around his heart cracking just a little more, letting in warmth he'd thought was impossible. "You're strong too, Bakugo," Izuku said quietly, leaning forward, his crystalline blue eyes meeting Bakugo's red ones directly. "Incredibly strong. You push yourself harder than anyone I know. You never give up no matter how many times you lose, and you have the raw power to be one of the greatest heroes ever. The only thing holding you back is the anger, the need to prove yourself, the way you measure everything in terms of strength and victory." He paused, choosing his words carefully, knowing this moment mattered, that what he said next could either solidify Bakugo's growth or shut him down completely. "But you're learning. I can see it. The way you fought at the sports festival wasn't just about winning. You were trying to understand my tactics, to grow from the loss. The way you've been treating our classmates lately, less aggressive, more willing to work with them. You're becoming the hero you always had the potential to be." Bakugo was silent for a long moment, processing that, and then, "I want to train with you, not to beat you, not to prove I'm stronger, to learn, to get better, to figure out how to care the way you do while still being myself." Izuku smiled, and this time it wasn't his playful deflection smile, Not his eternal winter mask. It was genuine warmth, the expression of someone who just witnessed a miracle and wanted to honor it. "Yeah," he said simply. "We can do that." They sat together in the quiet common room, two boys who'd started as childhood rivals and grown into something more complicated and valuable through conflict and competition and eventually understanding. Outside, actual winter snow began to fall, the natural kind that came with December weather, and Izuku felt the pull of it, the way real winter called to the winter spirit inside him. "You should go," Bakugo said, apparently reading his expression. "I can tell you want to be out there, in actual snow instead of the magic stuff you create. Go fly around or whatever it is you do when you think nobody's watching." Izuku hesitated, surprised by the perceptiveness, then nodded and stood, grabbing his staff. "Thanks, Bakugo, for talking like this. It means something." "Whatever," Bakugo muttered, but there was no real dismissiveness in his tone, just familiar gruffness that felt more like comfortable habit than actual hostility. "Don't freeze to death out there." "I'm already frozen," Izuku replied with a grin, and left through the dorm's front door before Bakugo could respond. The winter air hit him like a welcome embrace, cold and crisp and perfect. Snow was falling steadily, coating the UA grounds in white, and Izuku launched himself into it immediately, riding wind currents up into the sky, staff extended behind him like a tail, white hair whipping in the breeze. He flew through falling snow, feeling each flake as it formed, sensing the patterns of the storm, connected to winter in a way that went beyond quirks or physics into something fundamental and magical. He created frost patterns in the air as he flew. Crystalline designs that caught moonlight and reflected it in rainbow colors, art that would melt by morning but existed beautifully in this moment. He summoned stronger winds, spinning through the sky in aerial acrobatics that would have killed a normal person but felt natural to someone who'd been reborn as a winter spirit. He laughed, pure and genuine, the sound carrying across the frozen landscape, and felt completely, utterly himself. Below, he could see the lights of the dorm, warm and welcoming, and he knew his classmates were inside, probably getting ready for bed, maybe talking about the magical Christmas they'd shared. He could go back down anytime he wanted, could return to warmth and company and belonging. But for now, he needed this. Needed the solitude of flight, the connection to winter, the reminder that he was still the winter spirit even while learning to be Izuku Midoriya more completely. He flew until exhaustion began to creep in, his power vast but not infinite, and then descended slowly back to the dorm, landing barefoot in fresh snow outside the entrance. He stood there for a moment, looking up at the building, seeing it as more than just a school residence. It was home now, in a way nowhere had been since his mother's apartment, and that realization felt significant. Inside, he found Todoroki waiting in the common room, sitting by the window, watching snowfall. The dual quirk user looked up when Izuku entered, snowflakes melting in his white hair, and smiled that small, genuine expression he reserved for moments of real emotion. "Good flight?" Todoroki asked. "The best," Izuku replied, settling into the chair opposite him. "There's actual winter out there now, not just my magic. It feels different. More real somehow." "Your magic is real," Todoroki pointed out, "just a different kind of real." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching snow fall outside the window, two boys who understood loneliness and power and the strange space between human and something more. Eventually, Todoroki spoke again, his voice quiet but clear. "I talked to my mother today, called her, told her about Christmas, about the ice sculpture you made of our family. She cried." He paused, his heterochromatic eyes reflecting window light. But they were happy tears. She said it was beautiful that I had friends who cared enough to give me that gift, that she was proud of me for letting people in after keeping everyone at distance for so long. Izuku felt warmth bloom in his chest again, that same feeling from earlier when Uraraka had hugged him, when Bakugo had admitted growth, when the entire class had celebrated together in his winter wonderland. "That's good," he said softly. "Your mom sounds wonderful." "She is," Todoroki agreed. "I'm going to visit her during next break, bring my siblings if they'll come. Try to build something real from all the broken pieces. You inspired that, you know. Watching you create beauty from your power, watching you turn something that could be destructive into joy and connection." It made me think that maybe I could do the same with my family. You can, Izuku assured him. You're already doing it. Using your fire now, accepting both sides of yourself, working toward healing instead of holding on to resentment. That's brave, Todoroki. Braver than anything we do in combat training. They talked for another hour, sharing thoughts about family and belonging and what it meant to be powerful in a world that often feared power. Eventually, exhaustion won out and they headed to their respective rooms. But Izuku felt lighter than he had in years, like some burden he'd been carrying since that day in the lake had finally started to lift. Sleep came easier that night, and for once, Izuku didn't dream of drowning in frozen water or wandering alone through empty winter landscapes. Instead, he dreamed of flying with friends, of creating magic that brought laughter, of standing in warmth, real warmth, the kind that came from connection, and not feeling like he needed to run back to the cold. The days after Christmas blurred together in a comfortable routine. Classes resumed after the break, students returning to normal schedules, but something had shifted in Class 1A's dynamic. They were closer now, more cohesive, moving like a unit instead of a collection of individuals. During training exercises, they anticipated each other's moves, covered each other's weaknesses, worked together with the kind of synchronization that usually took years to develop. Aizawa noticed immediately, his tired eyes tracking their movements during a combat simulation, and afterward he pulled Izuku aside. "Whatever you did during Christmas break," the teacher said bluntly, "it changed the class dynamic. They're working together better, trusting each other more. That's good for hero work, but I need to know, are you doing something with your quirk to create this cohesion, or is it genuine?" Izuku blinked, genuinely confused. "I'm not doing anything. I just made it snow indoors and created some ice sculptures. That's all." Aizawa studied him with those analytical eyes that missed nothing, then nodded slowly. "Then it's genuine. You gave them a shared experience, something that bonded them beyond just being classmates. That's valuable, Midoriya. Don't underestimate the power of connection." The words stayed with Izuku as weeks passed and winter deepened into January, then February. Training intensified as their first year at UA progressed, exercises becoming more complex, scenarios more challenging. Izuku pushed himself harder than ever, exploring new applications of his winter powers. Seeing what he could create when he stopped being careful, he learned to make ice constructs that moved independently, puppets of frozen water that could fight alongside him or perform rescue operations in places too dangerous for humans. He discovered he could sense weather patterns hundreds of kilometers away, feel storms forming before meteorologists detected them, predict temperature changes with supernatural accuracy. He experimented with creating localized climate zones, turning small areas into winter regardless of actual season, maintaining them for hours or days without strain. And he trained with his classmates constantly, learning to combine his powers with theirs in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. With Uraraka, he developed aerial combat techniques where she made him weightless, and he created ice platforms in midair, letting them fight in 3 dimensions with devastating efficiency. With Tokoyami, he learned to use his ice to create shadows that strengthened Dark Shadow, making the shadow creature more powerful in environments Izuku controlled. Even with Bakugo, grudgingly at first but with increasing enthusiasm, he practiced combination attacks where explosions and ice created devastating synergies. But it was his training with Todoroki that produced the most dramatic results. The two of them spent hours working on balancing fire and ice, teaching each other techniques, pushing the boundaries of temperature-based quirks. Todoroki learned to create ice as unbreakable as Izuku's permafrost by infusing it with enough cold that heat couldn't overcome it. Izuku learned to appreciate fire's beauty, to see it not as his opposite but as winter's complement, the other half of a natural cycle. They developed a combination technique they called thermal shock. Todoroki would superheat an area with his flames, while Izuku simultaneously flash froze it with absolute cold, and the rapid temperature change would shatter anything caught between the two extremes. It was devastatingly effective and required perfect timing, the kind of synchronization that only came from deep trust and understanding. All Might watched their training sessions with a mixture of pride and concern, and one afternoon he called Izuku to his office for a private conversation. The symbol of peace looked smaller somehow in his deflated form, more human, and he gestured for Izuku to sit with the kind of gentle authority that made refusing impossible. Young Midoriya, All Might began, his sunken eyes serious despite his trademark smile. I've been watching your progress with great interest. Your power, your tactical intelligence, your ability to inspire cooperation in your classmates. These are all qualities of a great hero, but I'm concerned about something. Izuku waited, staff propped against his chair, crystalline blue eyes attentive. You're becoming stronger at an incredible rate, All Might continued, pushing your quirk to levels that frankly frighten me. The things you can do now, creating independent ice constructs, manipulating weather, sensing temperature across vast distances, these go beyond what we typically see in teenage heroes. And I worry that you're pushing yourself so hard because you still feel separate, still feel like you need to prove something. The observation hit closer than Izuku wanted to admit, and he found himself looking away, studying the frost patterns forming on the window behind All Might's desk. I'm not trying to prove anything, he said quietly. I just want to be strong enough to protect people who matter to me. My classmates, my friends, the ones who've finally made me feel like I belong somewhere. That's admirable, All Might acknowledged. But protection and self-destruction aren't the same thing. I've seen heroes burn themselves out, trying to be strong enough to save everyone, trying to shoulder every burden alone. The greatest lesson I've learned, and I learned it far too late, is that heroes need saving too. We need people who'll stand beside us, who'll share the weight, who'll remind us that we're human underneath the power. He leaned forward, his expression intense despite his weakened form. You have those people now, young Midoriya. Your classmates who trained with you, who celebrate your victories, who worry when you push too hard. Don't make the mistake I did of thinking you need to protect them by being invulnerable. Let them protect you too. That's what makes a team strong. Izuku absorbed the words, turning them over in his mind, seeing the truth in them even as part of him resisted. The winter spirit had always been alone, had existed for centuries without anyone to rely on, and that instinct towards self-sufficiency ran deep. But Izuku Midoriya wasn't just the winter spirit anymore. He was a student, a friend, part of something larger than himself. I'll try, he said finally, meeting All Might's eyes again. I can't promise it'll be easy. Being alone was safe for a long time, even if it was lonely. Letting people in, trusting them to help carry things, that's scarier than any villain I've fought. I know, All Might said gently, but you're already doing it, whether you realize it or not. The way you train with Todoroki, the trust you're building with Bakugo, the easy friendship with Uraraka and Ida, these are all steps toward genuine connection. Keep taking those steps, young Midoriya. They'll make you a better hero than raw power ever could. The conversation ended, but the words lingered, following Izuku through subsequent days and weeks. He found himself paying more attention to his relationships, noticing the small ways his classmates showed they cared, accepting help more readily instead of insisting he could handle everything alone. It felt strange and uncomfortable and wonderful all at once, like learning to walk on ground that wasn't frozen solid. March arrived with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into ranges that made Izuku's skin crawl, and he spent more time than usual in the air where it was cooler, riding wind currents above the school grounds. His classmates adapted, getting used to finding him on the roof or floating above the courtyard, and they started joining him sometimes. Uraraka making them weightless so they could sit on ice platforms. Izuku created in midair. It was during one of these aerial sessions, Izuku and Uraraka and Ida floating on a frozen platform above the school, that they saw the alert on Ida's phone. A villain attack in downtown Musutafu. Multiple casualties, heroes requesting backup. They weren't supposed to respond to real villain attacks without supervision, but Ida's expression went dark when he read the details. It's near my brother's agency, he said quietly, his usual formal composure cracking. I need to check if he's safe. Izuku understood immediately. Tensei Ida, the hero Ingenium, had recently returned to active duty after his injury, and any threat near his agency would set off every protective instinct Ida possessed. We should tell a teacher, Izuku said. even as he was already reaching for his phone. But before he could dial, the alert updated. Multiple agencies responding, situation deteriorating, requesting any available heroes in the area. And Izuku made a decision that All Might would probably lecture him about later, but felt necessary in the moment. "Uraraka, get Ida down safely," he said, standing on the ice platform, staff in hand. "I'm going to do a flyby, see if I can help with crowd control or rescue until the pros arrive. Stay here, don't follow me, and if I'm not back in 15 minutes, tell Aizawa where I went." "Midoriya, we should," Ida started, but Izuku was already launching himself into the air, riding wind currents toward downtown, white hair streaming behind him as he accelerated to speeds that left frost trails across the sky. He reached the scene in minutes, descending to find chaos, buildings damaged, civilians running, and at the center of it all, a massive villain with a magma-based quirk, spewing molten rock and superheated air. Pro heroes were engaging but struggling, their ice and water quirks evaporating before they could take effect, and Izuku saw immediately why the situation had escalated. Heat was the natural counter to everything Izuku represented, and this villain radiated enough of it to melt steel. But watching civilians flee, seeing heroes getting burned trying to contain the threat, Izuku felt something cold and determined settle in his chest. Heat was his opposite, yes, but cold could be absolute too, could push beyond normal physics into something fundamental. He descended like a winter storm, temperature dropping dramatically as he approached, and the villain looked up just in time to see a barefoot boy with white hair and a wooden staff pointing directly at him. Izuku didn't bother with warnings or hero banter. He just released a pulse of cold so intense that the air itself crystallized, moisture flash freezing into ice particles, and the villain's magma-covered body began to cool. Red-hot stone turning dark and brittle, the villain roared and tried to reignite his power to summon more heat, but Izuku was already moving, creating a dome of permafrost around the threat. Ice so cold it existed beyond normal temperatures, blocking heat from escaping or entering. Inside the dome, temperature plummeted catastrophically, and the magma villain's movements began to slow, his superheated quirk unable to overcome absolute cold in an enclosed space. Pro heroes stared in shock as this first-year student, they recognized the UA uniform, single-handedly neutralized a threat that had been overwhelming multiple agencies. Izuku maintained the ice dome while heroes evacuated civilians, and only when the area was clear did he allow the permafrost to fade slightly, enough for the pros to enter and restrain the now docile villain whose body temperature had dropped too low for his quirk to function. Endeavor arrived moments later, flames blazing, clearly expecting to dominate the situation, and stopped short when he saw it was already contained. His turquoise eyes locked onto Izuku with an intensity that made most people uncomfortable. But Izuku just smiled his usual playful smile and descended from the ice platform he'd been floating on. "Situation's under control," Izuku said cheerfully, as if he hadn't just defeated a villain that had required multiple pro heroes to even slow down. "Magma guy's cooled off, literally and figuratively. Probably needs medical attention for hypothermia, but he'll survive." Endeavor's expression was unreadable, flames still burning around his shoulders, and for a moment Izuku thought the flame hero might yell at him for interfering. Instead, Endeavor just studied him with those calculating eyes, clearly analyzing, assessing, seeing something that interested him. "You're Todoroki's classmate," Endeavor said, and it wasn't a question. "The ice user who beat him at the sports festival, Midoriya Izuku." "That's me," Izuku confirmed, staff propped casually over his shoulder, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. Endeavor was intimidating in person, his power radiating heat that made Izuku's skin crawl, and standing this close felt like being too near a furnace. "Your ice is stronger than Shoto's," Endeavor observed, not as an insult but as a tactical assessment. Colder, more versatile, apparently capable of overwhelming heat-based quirks through sheer temperature differential? How? Izuku considered deflecting, making a joke, but something in Endeavor's tones suggested genuine curiosity rather than competition. "Practice," he said simply. "And maybe because my quirk isn't divided between ice and fire, I can focus entirely on cold, push it to extremes without worrying about balance." Endeavor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Shoto's been training with you. I've seen improvements in his ice manipulation, techniques he didn't learn from me. You've been teaching him." Again, not a question, just observation, and Izuku nodded carefully, uncertain where this was going. "Good," Endeavor said, surprising him completely. "He needs training partners who challenge him, who push his limits. I've been unsuccessful at providing that kind of support." The admission seemed to cost him something, his expression flickering with what might have been regret before hardening again due to professional assessment. "Continue working with him. Make him stronger." Before Izuku could respond, other heroes approached, and Endeavor turned away to coordinate cleanup efforts, leaving Izuku standing there slightly dazed by the brief interaction. He'd expected hostility from Todoroki's father, expected the competitive drive that apparently defined the Flame Hero's personality, but instead he'd gotten something almost like approval. It was confusing and uncomfortable, and he decided to think about it later when he wasn't standing in the aftermath of a villain attack. Aizawa arrived minutes later, expression thunderous, and Izuku knew he was in for a lecture. The teacher dismissed the other pros with curt efficiency and turned that tired, disappointed gaze on his student. What part of "don't engage villains without supervision" was unclear? Aizawa asked, voice flat and dangerous. "The part where civilians were in danger and heroes were struggling," Izuku replied honestly, knowing deflection wouldn't work with Aizawa. "I saw the situation deteriorating and made a judgment call. It was the right call. Nobody got hurt except the villain, and he's alive." "It was reckless," Aizawa countered. "You're a first-year student, not a licensed pro. If that villain had countered your ice somehow, if backup hadn't arrived, if something had gone wrong, you could have died. And then I'd have to explain to your mother why I let her son get killed playing hero." The mention of his mother hit harder than expected, and Izuku's playful facade cracked slightly. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it was reckless. But I also know that hesitating, waiting for perfect conditions, following every rule exactly, that gets people killed too. Sometimes you have to make the call and deal with consequences later." Aizawa was silent for a long moment, studying him with those analytical eyes that saw everything. "You sound like All Might," he said finally. "That same reckless heroism, that willingness to throw yourself into danger for others. It's admirable and terrifying in equal measure." Is that a compliment or a criticism? Both. Aizawa's expression softened slightly, exhaustion showing through his professional composure. "You did well today, Midoriya. The Ice Dome was smart tactics, using your strength to neutralize his advantage. But next time, and there will be a next time, I know you well enough to recognize that, at least tell someone where you're going before you fly off to fight villains alone." "I did," Izuku pointed out. "I told Uraraka and Ida they were supposed to notify you if I wasn't back in 15 minutes. That's not the same as..." Aizawa paused, then sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Never mind. Just try not to die before graduation. I have enough paperwork already." They returned to UA together, Aizawa driving while Izuku sat in the passenger seat, staff propped between his knees, watching the city pass by through frost-covered windows. The teacher didn't lecture further, but his presence was companionable rather than hostile, and Izuku appreciated the quiet acceptance that he'd done something reckless but ultimately right. Back at the dorms, his classmates mobbed him immediately, having heard about the villain attack through news reports that featured dramatic footage of a white-haired student creating massive ice formations. Uraraka hugged him despite the cold. Ida lectured him about proper protocol while clearly relieved he was safe. And even Bakugo acknowledged the fight with a grudging, "Not bad, stopping that magma bastard alone." Todoroki pulled him aside later, away from the others, his expression serious. "My father called me, told me he met you at the attack site, that your ice was impressive." He paused, something complicated crossing his features. "He also said, I should keep training with you, that you're making me stronger. That's probably the closest he's come to admitting he can't teach me everything I need to know." "Your father's complicated," Izuku observed, leaning against the dorm wall, exhaustion finally catching up with him after the adrenaline of combat faded. "But I think he's trying to change in his own way, acknowledging that you need other teachers, that he's been unsuccessful at providing certain kinds of support. That's growth, even if it's slow." "Maybe." Todoroki said doubtfully. Or maybe he just sees you as a tool to make me stronger, another resource to exploit. But there was less bitterness in his voice than there would have been months ago, and Izuku counted that as progress. They stood together in comfortable silence, and eventually Todoroki spoke again, quieter this time. Thank you for being my friend, for seeing me as a person instead of Endeavor's son or a quirk to be used. It's meant more than I know how to express. Izuku felt that warmth bloom in his chest again, the thawing sensation that had become familiar over the past months. Same to you, he said simply. You were the first person at UA who really saw me, who understood what it's like to be lonely despite being surrounded by people. That mattered. Still matters. The weeks that followed the villain attack brought unexpected attention. News outlets had gotten clear footage of Izuku's ice dome, of the way he'd single-handedly neutralized a threat that required multiple pros, and suddenly the winter hero was trending on social media. His hero name hadn't been officially registered yet. That was still pending. The public decided to call him Jack Frost anyway, and the name stuck with viral persistence. Izuku found it both amusing and uncomfortable, this sudden fame. He'd wanted to be seen for so long, had spent years feeling invisible and overlooked, and now cameras followed him whenever he left campus. Reporters shouted questions about his quirk, and fan accounts dedicated to analyzing his combat style proliferated across the internet. It was everything he'd thought he wanted, and it felt hollow compared to the genuine connections he'd built with his classmates. Fame isn't the same as being known, he told Uraraka one afternoon when she asked if he enjoyed the attention. People see the ice, see the power, see the cool fights, but they don't see me, not really. They see what they want to see, their fantasy of what a winter hero should be. But we see you, Uraraka pointed out gently. Your actual friends, the people who know you're just Midoriya who likes flying and hates hot weather and creates beautiful things because it makes you happy. That's what matters, right? She was right, of course, and Izuku nodded, grateful for the perspective. The public could call him whatever they wanted, could project whatever image they preferred, as long as the people who actually mattered knew the truth. Training continued intensifying as the school year progressed toward its conclusion. All Might pushed them harder in hero classes, Aizawa's combat scenarios became increasingly complex, and even academic courses ramped up difficulty as finals approached. Izuku excelled across the board, his analytical mind handling theoretical work while his powers made practical exercises feel almost easy. But he noticed his classmates struggling more than he was, so he started study groups in the common room, using his winter magic to create comfortable temperatures while they worked through material together. He helped Kaminari with physics equations, explained chemical bonds to Ashido, worked through hero law with Ida, who somehow always found new questions to ask. His ice constructs became study aids, frozen models of molecular structures or battle scenarios rendered in crystalline detail. And slowly, the class's overall performance improved. Not because Izuku was carrying them, everyone still did their own work, but because having someone willing to explain things patiently, to create visual aids, to make studying feel less like torture and more like collaborative learning made all the difference. Bakugo joined the study groups eventually, claiming he just wanted to make sure nobody was learning shit wrong. But Izuku noticed how the explosive boy would quietly correct people's mistakes or offer tips on combat theory. It was growth, subtle but significant. And watching Bakugo learn to help others instead of just competing with them felt like witnessing a fundamental shift. Finals arrived, and Class 1A performed exceptionally well. Not just in combat practicals, where Izuku's ice and Todoroki's fire and ice and Bakugo's explosions dominated, but in written exams and theoretical assessments too. Their teacher noted the improvement with his usual tired approval, and Izuku felt pride that had nothing to do with his own scores and everything to do with seeing his friends succeed. But the peaceful progression of the school year was shattered 2 weeks before summer break, when the League of Villains launched their most coordinated attack yet. It happened during a public hero demonstration at a downtown venue where Class 1A was showcasing rescue techniques for elementary school students. The event was supposed to be safe, controlled, educational, Pro heroes supervising, media covering it, civilians watching from designated areas. Everything seemed normal until portals began opening across the venue, and villains poured through in organized waves. Kurogiri's mist gates deposited dozens of criminals simultaneously, each one positioned strategically to maximize chaos. Fire users targeted one section, forcing evacuations. Strong types attacked structural supports. Someone with a fear-inducing quirk sent civilians into panic. And at the center of it all, standing on a raised platform where children had been sitting moments before, was Shigaraki Tomura, hands clasped together in his signature pose, red eyes scanning the chaos until they locked onto Izuku. "There you are, Winter Boy," Shigaraki called out, his voice carrying despite the noise. "I've been looking forward to this. You made me look weak at USJ, embarrass the league in front of everyone. Today, I return the favor. Today, I take everything from you." Izuku's playful smile faded completely, replaced by an expression of cold assessment. Around him, his classmates were already moving into defensive positions, years of training kicking in automatically, but the villains kept coming through portals, endless reinforcements, and Izuku realized with growing dread that this wasn't a random attack. This was planned, coordinated, targeting them specifically. "Get the civilians out!" Aizawa shouted, his capture weapon already deployed, engaging villains with practiced efficiency. "Students, prioritize evacuation over combat. Pro heroes are en route, but we need to hold until..." A massive explosion cut off his words as a new Nomu emerged from a portal, this one covered in reflective scales that shimmered with heat distortion. It roared and lunged toward the clustered students, moving with speed that belied its size, and Izuku reacted on pure instinct. He created a permafrost barrier, ice so cold it cracked the air, positioning it between the Nomu and his classmates. The creature hit the ice at full speed and bounced off, the impact creating shockwaves that shattered windows, but the permafrost held. Izuku stood behind his barrier, staff extended, eyes coldly furious, and for the first time since arriving at UA, he let his classmates see the winter spirit without restraint. "Bakugo. Todoroki, you're with me on the Nomu," he commanded, his voice carrying authority that made even Bakugo follow without argument. "Uraraka, Ida, coordinate civilian evacuation with 13. Everyone else, defensive positions, keep the villains contained until the pros arrive. This is what we've trained for." They moved like a synchronized unit, each student falling into their role, and Izuku felt pride mixed with terror because they were good. They'd become genuinely competent heroes in training, but they were still just students facing an organized villain assault. The Nomu recovered quickly from its impact with the permafrost, and Izuku got his first clear look at it. The scales covering its body weren't just decorative. They were radiating heat, serious heat, enough to create visible distortion in the air. This thing had been designed specifically to counter him, to overcome ice through sustained thermal output, and Shigaraki's earlier words suddenly made terrible sense. They'd studied his weakness and built a weapon to exploit it. "Heat absorption," Bakugo observed, moving to flank the creature with his palms already crackling. "Things storing energy like a battery. Your ice will just make it stronger if you're not careful." "Then we don't use ice," Izuku decided, mind racing through options. "We go physical. Todoroki, can you use your fire to match its temperature, make it think we're the same heat level?" "I can try," Todoroki said, flames already blazing on his left side, stepping forward to draw the Nomu's attention. The creature lunged at Todoroki, apparently identifying him as the more immediate threat due to his flames. And Bakugo used the opening to blast it from behind with a concentrated explosion. The Nomu barely reacted, its scales absorbing the heat, getting brighter, and Izuku revised his tactical assessment. This thing wasn't just heat-resistant. It was heat-powered, getting stronger with every thermal attack they threw at it. "New plan," Izuku called, riding a wind current higher for better vantage. "We don't feed it. Pure physical attacks, no heat, no ice. Bakugo, use your explosions for movement only, not damage. Todoroki, switch to ice, try to slow it down mechanically without freezing. I'll provide support and look for weak points." They engaged in a desperate three-way coordination, each attack calculated to minimize heat transfer while maximizing physical force. Bakugo used shaped explosions to throw debris at the Nomu without touching it directly. Todoroki created ice walls that collapsed onto the creature, using weight and pressure instead of cold. Izuku manipulated wind currents to knock it off balance, to redirect its charges, to create openings his teammates could exploit, but it wasn't enough. The Nomu was too strong, too fast, and its heat-based power kept building, scales glowing brighter with each passing second. Worse, Izuku could see other fights happening across the venue, his classmates engaging villains, Aizawa struggling against multiple opponents, civilians still trapped in sections where evacuation was blocked. They were holding, but barely, and if pro-heroes didn't arrive soon, people were going to die. That's when Shigaraki made his move. Emerging from behind the Nomu with both hands extended toward Izuku, Decay Quirk ready to disintegrate anything he touched. "Let's see how well your winter magic works when you're dust," the villain hissed, lunging forward with deadly intent. Izuku dodged on reflex, riding a wind current straight up, but Shigaraki had anticipated the move. Another villain appeared above him, someone with a speed quirk Izuku hadn't accounted for, and grabbed for his staff, trying to disarm him. Izuku twisted in midair, using his staff like a weapon, striking the speedster's wrist hard enough to make them let go. But the distraction gave Shigaraki another opening. The villain's hand grazed Izuku's shoulder, just barely making contact, and Izuku felt the horrible sensation of his body beginning to disintegrate, cells breaking down, frost-pale skin cracking into ash. He reacted on pure instinct, flash freezing the affected area with such extreme cold that the cellular decay stopped, frozen tissue becoming too cold for Shigaraki's quirk to affect. But the damage was done. His shoulder was partially destroyed, pain shooting through his arm, and his staff slipped from suddenly numb fingers. He caught it with his other hand before it could fall, refusing to lose his weapon. But the pain was overwhelming, and his flight became unstable, wind currents faltering. He descended rapidly, barely managing to land instead of crash. And when he looked up, Shigaraki was smiling that horrible, scratchy smile. "There it is," the villain said with satisfaction. "The great winter hero, the Jack Frost who humiliated us at USJ, bleeding and hurt and weak. Let's see how your classmates react when I turn you to dust right in front of them." Rage flooded through Izuku, cold and absolute, and for the first time in his life as the Winter Spirit, he wanted to kill. Not capture, not neutralize, but actually end someone's existence, because Shigaraki was threatening everything Izuku had learned to care about, everyone he'd finally allowed himself to connect with, and that was unacceptable. The temperature dropped catastrophically, frost spreading from Izuku's position in a circle that grew by meters every second. The Nomu's scales stopped glowing as its heat was overwhelmed by absolute cold. Villains who'd been fighting his classmates froze solid where they stood. Windows shattered from thermal shock, metal became brittle. The very air itself began to crystallize into visible ice particles. "You want to see what I can really do?" Izuku asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent battlefield. No longer playful, no longer warm, just cold fury given form. "You want to see the Winter Spirit at full power, without restraint, without mercy? Fine. Let me show you what winter looks like when it's genuinely angry." He rose into the air, staff glowing with accumulated power, white hair crystallizing into actual ice, eyes blazing with cold light that had nothing human in it. Below, his classmates stared up in awe and fear because they'd never seen Izuku like this, had never witnessed the Winter Spirit truly unleashed. This wasn't their friend who made Christmas magical and trained with them and smiled constantly. This was something ancient and terrifying and absolutely unstoppable. Izuku created a blizzard that transformed the entire venue into a winter apocalypse. Snow fell in sheets so thick visibility dropped to meters. Wind howled with voices that sounded almost alive. Temperature plummeted to levels that should have been impossible. He froze the heat-based Nomu by going beyond physics, past absolute zero into conceptual cold, freezing not just matter but the idea of thermal energy itself, until the creature became a statue of frozen flesh that would never move again. Villains tried to flee through Kurogiri's portals, but Izuku froze the mist gates themselves, turning space-time manipulation into solid ice that trapped half-formed portals like bugs in amber. He created ice constructs that moved with intelligent purpose, winter guardians that corralled villains into groups, that protected civilians, that fought with the precision of someone who'd existed as winter itself for longer than anyone present had been alive. And through it all, he moved toward Shigaraki with deliberate intent, rain currents that had become winter gales, staff pointed like a spear at the villain who'd made this personal. Shigaraki backed away, hands extended, decay quirk ready, but his confidence was cracking because his carefully planned attack had failed spectacularly, and now he was facing something that looked less like a student and more like a natural disaster, given human shape. "You came to my school," Izuku said, each word precise and cold, frost forming in the air around his mouth. "You attacked my teachers, you threatened my friends, and you thought..." What? That I'd just let that happen? That I'd hold back because we're in public? Because there are civilians around? Because heroes are supposed to show mercy? He was close now, close enough that Shigaraki could reach out and touch him, but the villain's hands were trembling, his earlier madness replaced by something that might have been fear. Because touching Izuku right now would mean touching winter itself, and winter doesn't decay. It freezes, preserves, turns everything it touches into eternal stillness. "I am mercy," Izuku continued, his voice carrying despite the howling wind. "I'm the part of winter that brings snow days and ice skating and Christmas magic, but I'm also the blizzard, the avalanche, the cold that makes people huddle for warmth or die alone. You wanted to see that side? Here it is." He raised his staff, preparing to freeze Shigaraki solid to end this threat permanently, and for one terrible moment, he genuinely intended to kill. But then he heard a voice, cutting through the blizzard with desperate urgency. "Midoriya, stop!" Todoroki appeared beside him, somehow navigating the storm through a combination of his own ice and sheer determination, and his heterochromatic eyes met Izuku's blazing ones, with the kind of understanding that came from knowing exactly what it felt like to lose control. "Don't do this," Todoroki said, not pleading, but stating fact. "Not like this. Not in rage. You're not a killer, Izuku. You bring joy, you create beauty, you make people happy. Don't let him turn you into something else." "He tried to kill me," Izuku replied, his voice still cold, still inhuman. "He tried to kill you, all of you, just to hurt me. Why shouldn't I?" "Because we're still here," Todoroki interrupted. "We're alive, we're safe, and that's because of you. You protected us. You stopped them. That's what heroes do. They protect people, not execute villains, no matter how much they deserve it." The words penetrated the cold fury, found the human part of Izuku still buried under winter's wrath, and he felt something crack in his chest. The blizzard began to slow, snow falling less violently, wind dying to strong gusts instead of killing gales. His eyes, which had been glowing with inhuman light, faded back to their normal crystalline blue, and the ice in his hair melted slightly, returning to just white instead of actual frozen water. "I'm so angry," Izuku admitted, his voice breaking slightly, sounding young and frightened instead of ancient and terrible. "I've never been this angry. I wanted to kill him, Todoroki. I actually wanted to watch him freeze and know I'd ended him." "What does that make me?" "Human," Todoroki said simply, his own fire blazing on his left side, warming the space around them both. "It makes you human, angry and protective and willing to do terrible things to defend people you care about. That's what makes you one of us instead of just the winter spirit. You care enough to feel rage when we're threatened." Around them, the blizzard was dissipating completely now, revealing the aftermath of Izuku's fury. Every villain was frozen solid, trapped in ice that would take hours to melt. The heat-based Nomu was a statue that would never move again, its cellular structure too damaged by conceptual cold. The entire venue looked like something from a winter fairy tale, beautiful and terrifying and proof of what happened when someone pushed the winter spirit too far. Pro-heroes were arriving in force now, flooding through entrances, taking in the scene with expressions of shock and awe. All Might crashed down in the center of it all, larger than life even in his weakened state, and his eyes found Izuku immediately, saw the frost still clinging to his skin, the ice that had formed in his hair, the way he looked less like a teenager and more like an ancient winter deity. "Young Midoriya," All Might said carefully, approaching slowly like someone trying not to spook a dangerous animal. "Are you all right? Are you in control?" Izuku laughed, and it sounded bitter even to his own ears. "I don't know. Am I? I just froze dozens of villains, destroyed a Nomu that was specifically designed to counter me, and almost killed their leader because I was angry. Does that sound controlled to you? It sounds like you protected your classmates. All Might replied gently, reaching Izuku and placing one massive hand on his uninjured shoulder. Like you stopped a villain attack that could have killed civilians and students. Like you used your power to save people instead of hurt them, even when you were furious enough to want revenge. That takes more control than you realize. The temperature around them was starting to normalize, Izuku's subconscious control reasserting itself, pulling back the winter he'd unleashed. His classmates were emerging from where they'd taken shelter, staring at the frozen battlefield, at the proof of what their friend could do when he stopped holding back. Some looked frightened, others looked awed. But when Uraraka approached and hugged him despite the lingering cold, despite the frost still coating his skin, Izuku felt something inside him finally settle. "That was terrifying," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled. "Watching you lose your smile, seeing you get so cold and angry, it was like watching someone I know become someone else entirely. But you came back. Todoroki reached you and you came back. That matters." "I almost killed him," Izuku whispered, aware of Shigaraki being carried away by pro-heroes, still alive, still breathing, saved by Todoroki's intervention and Izuku's last-second restraint. "But you didn't," she countered. "You chose not to. Even when you were that angry, even when you had the power and the justification, you chose to be a hero instead of an executioner. That's what makes you you." Medical teams arrived, forcing Izuku to sit down so they could examine his partially disintegrated shoulder. The damage was severe. Shigaraki's decay had eaten away tissue and muscle before Izuku's freeze had stopped it, and Recovery Girl would need to work overtime to heal it properly. But it could have been worse. If Izuku hadn't frozen the affected area immediately, if the decay had spread even slightly more, he might have lost the entire arm. Aizawa appeared beside him while medics worked, his expression exhausted but intense. "That display of power," the teacher said bluntly, "was the most terrifying thing I've seen from a student in 20 years of teaching. You turned the entire venue into a frozen hellscape, destroyed a Nomu that multiple pro-heroes would have struggled with, and came within seconds of executing a villain in front of children. Do you understand how serious this is?" "I understand I lost control," Izuku replied quietly, wincing as a medic prodded his injured shoulder. "I let anger override my judgment. Let the winter spirit's power run wild instead of channeling it properly. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Aizawa said, but there was no real anger in his tone, just concern. "I know you were protecting your classmates. Know the attack was personal and calculated to hurt you specifically. But heroes who lose control, who let rage dictate their actions, they become villains themselves, no matter how good their intentions. You have the power to reshape environments, Midoriya. That comes with responsibility to never use it carelessly." The lecture continued for several more minutes. Hideku absorbed it without argument because Aizawa was right. He'd lost himself in fury. Let the winter spirit's ancient instincts override his human judgment, and if Todoroki hadn't intervened, he might have crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That was terrifying in ways villain attacks could never be, because it meant the real danger might not be external threats, but his own capacity for destruction when pushed too far. They were all taken back to UA for medical treatment and debriefing. Recovery Girl worked on Izuku's shoulder for hours, using her healing quirk to regenerate damaged tissue, scolding him the entire time about reckless behavior and the importance of defense. By the time she finished, his arm was mostly functional again, though she warned him it would be weak for several days, and he needed to avoid using his staff until fully healed. The principal called him to his office late that evening, Nezu's intelligent eyes assessing Izuku with the kind of analytical precision that missed nothing. "Midoriya Izuku," the principal began, sipping tea with precise manners, "you prevented a major tragedy today. Civilian casualties were minimal due to your quick response, and the villain attack was neutralized largely through your individual efforts. The Hero Commission will likely commend you officially." "But," Izuku prompted, sensing there was more. "But you also displayed a level of power and lack of restraint that concerns many people, myself included," Nezu continued candidly. You froze an entire venue, created environmental effects that will take days to fully reverse, and nearly killed a villain in front of witnesses, including elementary school children. The public reaction is mixed, some calling you a hero, others calling you dangerous. How do you feel about that? Izuku considered the question seriously, looking down at his bandaged shoulder, remembering the rage that had consumed him, the cold fury that had wanted Shigaraki dead. I feel like I learned something important today, he said finally. That power without control is dangerous regardless of intentions. That anger is valid but shouldn't dictate actions. That I have friends who will stop me from doing something I'd regret forever. And that being seen as dangerous might be necessary if it means people I care about stay safe. A mature answer, Nezu observed, setting down his teacup with a soft click. Though I worry you're accepting the burden of being feared too readily. Heroes should inspire hope, not terror. The winter spirit has always been both, Izuku replied quietly. Children love snow and ice skating and Christmas magic, but they also fear blizzards and avalanches and the cold that kills. I can't be one without the other. All I can do is try to make sure people see the joy more than the danger. Then continue trying, Nezu said, his tone gentler, because the world needs heroes who bring joy as much as it needs ones who bring strength. Don't lose that part of yourself in pursuit of power. The conversation ended and Izuku returned to the dorms to find his classmates gathered in the common room, clearly waiting for him. They looked up when he entered, and for a moment no one spoke, the weight of what had happened hanging between them like fresh snow waiting to be disturbed. Then Bakugo stood, crossed the room, and punched Izuku's uninjured shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. That's for scaring the shit out of us with your frozen apocalypse, he said gruffly. Then he grabbed Izuku's good shoulder and squeezed, almost gentle. And that's for protecting everyone, even when you were hurt. Don't do it again, but thanks. The gesture broke the tension, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, sharing their perspectives on the battle, asking if Izuku was okay, admitting they'd been frightened but also amazed by his power. Uraraka hovered nearby, ready to catch him if his injuries made him unstable. Ida lectured about proper hero protocols while clearly relieved everyone survived. Even Tokoyami, usually reserved, admitted that watching Izuku's blizzard had been both terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. But it was Todoroki who pulled Izuku aside later when the crowd had dispersed slightly, his expression serious but not judgmental. "Thank you for listening to me," he said quietly. "When I told you to stop, to come back, I wasn't sure you'd hear me through the rage, but you did, and that means everything." "You reached me when no one else could," Izuku admitted, leaning against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up to him. "Because you understand what it's like to have power that scares you, to feel like you might lose yourself to it. That understanding saved Shigaraki's life, probably saved my soul too." "We keep each other human," Todoroki said, and it wasn't a question, just acknowledgement of the truth they both knew. "When I forget why I want to be a hero, when the pressure from my father gets too heavy, you remind me there's joy in this too. When you forget you're human underneath the winter spirit, when power threatens to consume you, I remind you that you're Izuku Midoriya, our friend. That's what we do for each other." They stood together in comfortable silence, two lonely boys who'd found understanding in each other, who'd become something more than friends through shared trauma and mutual support. Eventually, Todoroki spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father wants to meet with you formally. He called earlier, asked if you'd visit his agency during summer break, said he wants to discuss your ice techniques and possibly offer training. I told him I'd ask you, but that the decision was yours." Izuku considered that, turning the idea over in his mind. Training with Endeavor would be challenging, possibly uncomfortable given their opposite power sets, but it might also help him understand balance better, learn to coexist with heat instead of just opposing it. "What do you think I should do?" he asked Todoroki. "I think you should do whatever feels right for you," Todoroki replied. "My father is trying to change, trying to be better, but he's still Endeavor, still competitive, still driven by that need to be number one. If you train with him, it'll be intense and possibly overwhelming, but it might also teach you things you can't learn anywhere else." "Then I'll consider it," Izuku decided. Talk to him after summer starts, see what he's offering, make a judgment call then. Right now, I'm too tired to think about anything beyond getting through finals and maybe sleeping for a week straight. Todoroki smiled, small and genuine, and they rejoined their classmates who were still processing the day's events, still coming to terms with seeing their friend become something ancient and terrifying before choosing to be human again. The days that followed brought unexpected changes. News coverage of the villain attack focused heavily on Izuku's role, showing footage of his blizzard, his ice constructs, the frozen villains, and destroyed Nomu. Public opinion was divided, some calling him a hero, others expressing fear about a first-year student with that level of power, still others debating whether his near execution of Shigaraki constituted appropriate force or excessive violence. But within Class 1A, something had solidified. They'd seen their friend nearly lose himself to rage and power, had watched him come back from the edge, had witnessed the genuine struggle between being human and being something more. And instead of fear or judgment, they responded with deeper trust, with understanding that Izuku was doing his best to balance impossible contradictions, that he needed support, not isolation. Training sessions became more collaborative. Students who'd previously worked alone started partnering with Izuku, learning how to coordinate with someone whose power could reshape entire battlefields. Bakugo developed combination techniques where his explosions complemented Izuku's ice instead of conflicting with it. Uraraka practiced aerial rescues using platforms Izuku created mid-flight. Even Mineta, usually focused solely on his own perverted schemes, asked Izuku to help develop tactics using sticky spheres and ice together. And Izuku, for his part, learned to accept help more readily. When exhaustion threatened after particularly intense training, he let classmates convince him to rest instead of pushing through. When his injured shoulder ached despite Recovery Girl's healing, he admitted it instead of pretending everything was fine. When the weight of being seen as dangerous pressed too heavily, he talked about it with Todoroki or Uraraka or even Aizawa, letting others share the burden. Finals came and went. Class 1A performing exceptionally well despite the trauma of the villain attack. Their practical exams involved fighting teacher-student teams, and Izuku found himself paired with Tokoyami against Present Mic. The sound-based hero's quirk should have been overwhelming, but Izuku created ice barriers that dampened sonic attacks, while Tokoyami's dark shadow engaged from angles Mike couldn't cover simultaneously. They passed with high marks, Mike cheerfully declaring them way too clever for first years, before nearly deafening them with his enthusiastic praise. Summer break arrived with oppressive heat that made Izuku's skin crawl and his powers fluctuate uncomfortably. He spent most of the first week in air-conditioned spaces or floating in the sky where temperatures were cooler, avoiding the ground-level heat that felt like torture against his winter-attuned body. But then, Endeavor's official invitation arrived. A formal request for Izuku to visit his agency for a week-long intensive training program focused on advanced temperature manipulation and combat application in adverse conditions. Todoroki delivered it personally, his expression carefully neutral, clearly uncertain how Izuku would respond. "He's serious about this," Todoroki explained, sitting in Izuku's dorm room where strategic ice made the temperature bearable. "He doesn't extend training offers to students outside his agency normally. Whatever he saw in you during that villain attack, it impressed him enough to break his usual patterns." Izuku read the invitation carefully, noting the formal language, the specific focus on temperature manipulation, the way Endeavor avoided mentioning his son at all in the letter. This wasn't about Todoroki, wasn't about using Izuku to make Shoto stronger. This was genuine interest in Izuku's abilities, recognition of his potential, possibly even respect. "I'll go," Izuku decided, looking up to meet Todoroki's heterochromatic eyes. "Not because I want to impress your father, not because I think I need what he's offering, but because understanding heat better might help me control cold more precisely, and because refusing out of fear of discomfort would be letting heat win, and winter doesn't surrender to summer." "Very poetic," Todoroki observed dryly, but there was warmth in his expression, approval of Izuku's reasoning. "Just don't let him push you too hard. My father's idea of training borders on torture sometimes. I've died and been reborn as a winter spirit. Izuku pointed out with his usual playful smile. "I think I can handle your dad's training regimen." The week at Endeavor's agency was indeed intense, possibly the most physically and mentally challenging training Izuku had experienced since his transformation. Endeavor didn't treat him like a student or a guest. He treated him like a professional hero who needed refinement, pushing Izuku's limits with the same ruthless efficiency he apparently applied to his own training. They started with heat resistance exercises, Endeavor using his flames to create environments that made Izuku profoundly uncomfortable while forcing him to maintain ice constructs under thermal stress. The point wasn't to make Izuku stronger in heat, that would never happen given his fundamental nature, but to teach him how to function when conditions were hostile, how to channel power efficiently when every instinct screamed to retreat to cold. Your ice is stronger than Shoto's because you understand it completely, Endeavor observed during one particularly brutal session, his flames blazing hot enough to make Izuku's skin feel like it was burning despite not actually catching fire. But that specialization becomes a weakness when facing opponents who counter you. Heroes need versatility, need the ability to function in any environment. So we're teaching your body to tolerate what your mind already understands, that heat and cold aren't enemies, they're parts of the same cycle. The words made sense even through the discomfort, and Izuku forced himself to maintain his ice wall even as Endeavor's flames pressed against it. Even as sweat, rare for him, began forming on his pale skin, even as every instinct demanded he flood the area with cold to protect himself. This was about discipline, about control, about learning that power meant choosing how and when to use it, not just unleashing it reflexively. They also worked on combination techniques, Endeavor demonstrating how fire and ice could complement each other instead of opposing. Rapid temperature changes created pressure differentials that enhanced both powers. Ice could be used to shape flames, directing them with frozen barriers into concentrated streams. Fire could be used to partially melt ice, creating water that refroze into different structures with properties normal ice couldn't achieve. You and Shoto could be unstoppable together if you learned to synchronize properly, Endeavor said during one session, watching Izuku create steam using carefully controlled ice and residual heat. He has fire and ice naturally, but he's still learning to balance them. You have ice mastered completely and understand winter on an instinctive level, teaching each other, learning from each other's perspectives. That's how both of you grow beyond your current limits. Izuku absorbed the tactical advice, filing it away for future training sessions with Todoroki, but he couldn't help asking the question that had been bothering him since arriving. Why are you doing this? Training me, I mean. I'm not your student, not part of your agency, not even particularly interested in becoming a fire and ice specialist. What do you get out of this? Endeavor was silent for a long moment, his flames dimming slightly as he considered the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically quiet. Because I failed my son by being too rigid, too focused on my own path, too unwilling to see that he needed more than I could provide. You've given Shoto something I couldn't, the freedom to choose who he wants to be, the understanding that power is a tool, not a cage, the friendship that reminds him he's human underneath the quirk. That's valuable, that's worth repaying. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest, and Izuku saw Endeavor not as the intimidating flame hero or the abusive father, but as someone genuinely trying to change, to be better, to acknowledge mistakes without letting them define his future. Todoroki's lucky to have you trying, Izuku said carefully. Not everyone gets parents who recognize their failures and work to fix them. Just keep trying, keep being better. That's what matters. They trained for the rest of the week, Izuku's heat tolerance improving marginally, while his tactical understanding grew significantly. By the end, he could maintain ice constructs in temperatures that would have melted them effortlessly before, could function in hostile environments without losing effectiveness, could even create specialized ice that absorbed heat instead of just resisting it. Endeavor saw him off on the last day with unexpected warmth, metaphorical warmth. His flames had cooled, and actually smiled. Small but genuine. You're going to be a great hero, Midoriya Izuku. Not because of your power, though that's considerable, but because you understand that strength without compassion is just destruction. Don't lose that understanding as you grow stronger. Izuku returned to UA with new techniques, deeper understanding, and strange appreciation for someone he'd initially viewed as purely antagonistic. The experience had taught him that people contained multitudes, that the same person could be both abusive father and dedicated hero, that growth was possible even for those who'd made terrible mistakes. The rest of summer passed in lazy contentment. Izuku spent time with his mother, who hugged him carefully around his still healing shoulder and cried when she saw news footage of the villain attack. He visited Manuel's agency for a brief internship, doing patrol work and rescue practice. He trained with classmates who'd stayed near campus, developing new combination techniques, pushing boundaries in safer environments than actual villain fights. And he flew. Almost every evening, he'd launch himself into warm summer air, still uncomfortable but bearable, and ride wind currents above the city, creating frost patterns and ice sculptures that melted quickly in the heat but existed beautifully while they lasted. He'd watch the sunset, see lights come on across Musutafu, feel connected to the world below in ways that had seemed impossible 11 years ago, when he'd been a lonely boy drowning in frozen water. Second year at UA began with Class 1A having earned reputations that preceded them. They were the class that survived USJ, that handled the sports festival brilliantly, that stopped a coordinated villain attack with minimal casualties. Underclassmen stared at them in hallways, other departments treated them with cautious respect, and teachers pushed them harder than ever because they'd proven they could handle it. Izuku found himself in a strange position, simultaneously famous as Jack Frost, the winter hero, and known among his classmates as just Midoriya, who brought joy and created beauty, and sometimes lost himself to winter's fury, but always came back. The duality was challenging, requiring him to balance public persona with private reality, but his friends helped by refusing to treat him differently despite the fame. New challenges arrived with second year. More complex rescue scenarios, villains that required team tactics to defeat, situations where individual power wasn't enough and collaboration became essential. Izuku excelled at coordinating teams, his analytical mind seeing patterns others missed, his powers versatile enough to support virtually any strategy, but he also learned to step back sometimes, to let others lead, to be the support instead of the primary force. When Bakugo took point on an urban combat exercise, Izuku created ice platforms for him to use as launch points. When Uraraka coordinated an aerial rescue, Izuku shaped wind currents to make her job easier. When Ida needed to evacuate civilians quickly, Izuku froze obstacles out of his path. The lesson All Might had tried to teach, that heroes need saving too, that strength comes from connection, finally settled into Izuku's bones as truth instead of just words. He didn't have to shoulder everything alone, didn't have to be invulnerable or perfect or constantly proving his worth. He just had to be himself. Izuku Midoriya, who was also the winter spirit, human and magical together, strong enough to protect but wise enough to accept protection in return. Winter arrived again, his favorite season, and Izuku created another Christmas wonderland in the dorms, though less elaborate than last year's. This time it was collaborative. Todoroki helped with ice sculptures, Bakugo used careful explosions to create ambient light effects, Uraraka made decorations float in precise patterns. The result was beautiful, magical, and proof that they'd all grown together, learned to complement each other's strengths instead of just showcasing individual powers. They stood together in their collaborative winter wonderland on Christmas Eve. Class 1A gathered in the common room that had become their shared home, and Izuku felt that warmth again, deeper and more permanent than before. He wasn't alone anymore. He had people who saw him, really saw him, not just the power or the fame or the pretty ice, but the lonely boy underneath who'd spent 11 years learning to smile while feeling empty. Next year, Bakugo said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, we're going to be pros, licensed heroes doing real work. That's insane. We're ready, Ida assured him with typical confidence. Our training has prepared us for... We're not ready, Izuku interrupted gently, and everyone looked at him in surprise. We're strong, we're skilled, we work well together, but Ready? No. We still have so much to learn, so much growing to do. And that's okay. Being a hero isn't about being perfect or ready. It's about trying anyway, about protecting people even when you're scared, about standing up even when you're not sure you can. Deep thoughts from the Ice Boy, Kaminari observed, but there was no mockery in his tone, just acknowledgement. The Winter Spirit has had a long time to think about heroism. Izuku replied with his playful smile. 11 years of practice. You'd think I'd have figured it out by now. They laughed together, the sound warm despite the cold air, and Izuku knew that this moment, these people, this sense of belonging, was worth every year of loneliness, every moment of isolation, every struggle to be seen. He'd found his place, found people who accepted all parts of him, found a way to be both the ancient winter spirit and a normal teenage boy. Spring came eventually, as it always did, temperatures rising, snow melting, warmth returning to the world. Izuku stood outside the dorms on the first genuinely warm day, barefoot in grass that was turning green again, feeling the uncomfortable heat against his pale skin. His classmates emerged wearing light jackets despite the pleasant temperature, joining him outside with the kind of casual ease that meant they weren't thinking about it, just being together. You know, Uraraka said, floating slightly to sit on an ice platform Izuku created automatically for her. When we first met, I thought you were sad, lonely, like you were going through the motions of being happy without actually feeling it. I was, Izuku admitted, creating more platforms so others could sit comfortably. For a really long time, happiness was just something I performed, not something I felt. Smiling became automatic, like breathing, just part of existing. And now, she prompted gently. Izuku considered the question, looking around at his gathered classmates, Bakugo arguing with Kaminari about something trivial, Todoroki watching clouds with that peaceful expression he'd developed over the past year, Ida organizing a study group nobody had asked for, Tokoyami meditating in the shade while Dark Shadow played with Ashido's acid bubbles. This chaotic, wonderful collection of future heroes who'd somehow become family. Now it's real, he said simply. The smiling, the joy, the feeling of connection. It took 11 years, but I finally thought enough to let people in, to let myself feel warmth that doesn't come from temperature, but from belonging. Todoroki moved to stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder with the kind of comfortable proximity that came from deep friendship. You know what I think? The dual quirk user asked, his voice quiet enough that only Izuku could hear. I think the boy who fell in the lake and the winter spirit who was reborn were always the same person. You just needed time to integrate them, to realize that being magical and being human aren't contradictions. You're both. You've always been both. Maybe, Izuku allowed, feeling truth in the words. Or maybe I needed to find people who could see both parts, who didn't ask me to choose between being Izuku Midoriya and being Jack Frost. Maybe that's what integration really means. Not picking one identity, but letting them coexist. They stood together as spring afternoon stretched toward evening, the future heroes of Class 1A existing in the comfortable space between who they'd been and who they were becoming. Izuku knew challenges remained ahead, villains to fight, people to save, lessons to learn. But he also knew he wouldn't face them alone, wouldn't have to shoulder every burden in isolated silence. He had friends now, real friends who'd seen him at his worst, consumed by fury, nearly crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, and chose to stay anyway, who'd seen him at his best, creating Christmas magic, protecting civilians, bringing joy through winter wonders, and appreciated it without putting him on a pedestal. Who understood that he was complicated and contradictory, and sometimes struggled with the weight of ancient power in a teenage body, and accepted those struggles as part of who he was. The sun set gradually, painting the sky in colors that had nothing to do with ice or winter, and Izuku stayed with his classmates as darkness fell. When stars began appearing, he created a gentle snowfall despite the warm evening, soft flakes that melted before hitting the ground but existed beautifully in the air, catching starlight and reflecting it in rainbow patterns. Show off, Bakugo muttered, but he was smiling, actually smiling, and that small expression meant more than Izuku could articulate. It's what I do, Izuku replied cheerfully, spinning his staff lazily, winter magic flowing through it like breath, like heartbeat. like something fundamental to his existence. Bring joy, create beauty, make people smile. That's the winter spirit's purpose. That's my purpose. And protecting us, Uraraka added, catching snowflakes in her palm and examining them with wonder despite having seen Izuku's magic countless times. Don't forget that part. You're also the friend who will freeze anyone who threatens people he cares about. Fair point, Izuku acknowledged, thinking about Shigaraki frozen mid-attack, about the villains encased in ice, about the Nomu that would never move again because he'd pushed cold beyond physical limits into conceptual absolute. Though I'm trying to be better about the whole nearly killing people in rage thing. You're doing great, Todoroki assured him dryly. It's been months since you lost control and created a winter apocalypse, very restrained. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the darkening grounds, and Izuku felt something settle in his chest, something that had been restless and uncertain for 11 years finally finding peace. He was home. Not in a place, not in his mother's apartment or Yue's dorms, but in the connections he'd built, the relationships he'd nurtured, the family he'd found among people who understood what it meant to be different and powerful, and sometimes lonely, despite being surrounded by others. The winter spirit would always be part of him, ancient and magical and fundamentally separate from normal humanity. But Izuku Midoriya was part of him too, young and hopeful and desperately wanting to connect, despite the cold that defined his existence. Together, those two aspects created something unique, someone who could bring winter's joy without its isolation, who could wield immense power with the kind of compassion that came from understanding loneliness intimately. He was the winter guardian, protector of those who mattered, creator of beauty and magic, the boy who died in frozen water and been reborn as something more. And he was Izuku Midoriya, student at UA, member of Class 1A, friend to people who saw him and knew him and accepted him completely. Both identities were real. Both were valid. And finally, after 11 years of struggle and growth and slowly learning to thaw, Izuku understood they didn't need to conflict. He could be magical and human together, could exist in the space between winter and warmth, could smile genuinely while still carrying cold in his bones. The evenings stretched into night, his classmates eventually retreating indoors, leaving Izuku alone with stars and gentle snowfall and the quiet satisfaction of belonging. He stood barefoot in grass that should have been uncomfortable for someone attuned to ice, feeling the earth beneath him, connected to the world in ways that went beyond power or magic into something simpler and more profound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, classes and training, and the continuing journey toward becoming professional heroes. There would be villains to fight, people to save, moments when his power would be tested and his control threatened. He would struggle sometimes, would feel the pull of isolation that had defined so much of his existence, would question whether genuine connection was possible for someone fundamentally as cold as winter itself. But tonight, standing under stars, with the memory of laughter still warming his chest, Izuku knew the answer to that question. Connection was possible. Belonging was real. He'd found it against all odds, found people who could see past frost and eternal smiles to the person underneath, who valued him for more than just the magic he created. The snow stopped falling gradually, his conscious control releasing it, and Izuku looked down at his bare feet, at the frost patterns that formed automatically wherever he stood, at the visible proof that he would always be different, would always be cold, would always exist slightly apart from normal warmth. But different didn't mean alone anymore. Cold didn't mean isolated. And existing apart from normal warmth didn't prevent him from finding his own kind of heat in the connections he'd built, the trust he'd earned, the love, platonic and profound, that his friends offered without reservation. He was Izuku Midoriya, reborn as Jack Frost, living as the winter spirit in human form, learning to be both magical and mortal together. And for the first time since that day 11 years ago, when he'd fallen through ice into frozen water and emerged as something more than human, he felt genuinely, completely, perfectly warm. The warmth didn't come from temperature. It came from belonging, from being known, from having people who would stand beside him through blizzards and battles and every challenge the future might bring. That warmth was more powerful than any heat, more sustaining than any fire, because it existed independent of physics in the space where connection lived. Izuku smiled, genuine and bright, and his crystalline blue eyes reflected starlight as he finally truly understood what All Might had tried to teach him, what his friends had been showing him all along. That strength came not from standing alone, but from accepting you never had to. That power meant protecting others and letting them protect you in return. That being a hero was less about individual capabilities and more about the connections you built and maintained and nurtured until they became unbreakable. He walked back toward the dorms, barefoot steps leaving frost prints in the grass, staff swinging lazily at his side, white hair catching moonlight and looking almost silver. Behind him, the frost melted slowly, returning the grass to normal, leaving no permanent mark of his passing. But inside the dorms, in the common room where his friends were gathered, in the relationships he'd built with patience and care and slowly learning trust, there his impact would remain, permanent and profound, proof that the winter spirit had finally found his place among the warmth of human connection. And Izuku Midoriya, the boy who died and been reborn as winter itself, crossed the threshold into home, wearing a smile that was finally, after 11 years of practice and struggle and growth, completely and genuinely real.
A massive thank you to the legends supporting the channel. Starting us off, a huge shout out to our pro hero, Javon McGuire. Next up, thank you to the absolute pillars of the community, our symbol of peace tier. Neostar Productions, Asael Cardenas, Shaquan Simmons, Agros Saxa 298, Sunawin 631, Elijah Saunders, Peter Hamilton, Freddy_Rose, Omega, Toxic Rune, Chris Talley, Alexander Thompson, Remorsefuls, Blackvein, Joshua Hedrington, Aaron Abercrombie, Drift Skater, Akano Hijima, Corey Tokars, Kewen Thompson, Yan, Exo Hope 3656, Devin Black, Crow, Yizbrid, Roberto Ramos Di Cristina, Dasher Games, Joe Bros, Rave on Crimson River, Dante Alistar, Adam Yonkers, Blood Saints, Donna Cafe, Zeph, KC, Howie60, Ignacio, and Albert.
And finally, massive love to the heavy hitters holding it all down, the hope of the universe. Debbie Vo, Gov Dizzles 21, LS Morningstar, Marl, Spintown, I Shoot X50, Greg Green, James, Juan, I'm Calver, and Colsey. You guys are the best. The cold never bothered us anyway, but a villain freeze frame definitely helps. If you loved this icy twist on Deku's destiny, smash that subscribe button to join our squad of guardians. Comment below which winter move Izuku should master next, and I'll catch you in the next theory.